Class solidarity, cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed, deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Michael Brooks, welcome to the Nomiki Show. First time appearance, hopefully not the last time.
First time, long time.
That is very true. First time and long time.
That's right. Good to be back.
The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. Yeah. Clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed, deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. 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 We clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Michael Brooks, welcome to the Nomiki Show. First time appearance. Hopefully not the last time.
First time, long time.
That is very true. First time and long time.
That's right. Good to be back. Sort of.
Sort of.
Well, because we had our aborted mission yesterday, but
Yeah,
it's
we can
awesome.
tell people about that. Maybe
We
that
had tech problems.
We had some tech problems. My microphone cut out halfway through the interview. You were on a roll, but maybe we can offer patrons that cut of the interview as some sort of like extra, because it's
Okay.
Yeah,
Go
why
for
not?
it.
I don't know. I'm learning from you.
Absolutely. I
do
mean,
you
you
think,
said
Chris?
some kind of anti-Semitic stuff in there, but yeah, I don't hold it against you. If you want people to hear it, it's cool.
Now they're going to
I don't
demonetize
care.
me on YouTube because you just said that.
Oh, I said that in the first. Sorry, it was the first
Yes.
minute. Right. I should have
First minute.
waited.
We'll cut that. We'll
Waited.
put that at the end.
Yeah.
So, Michael, welcome to the show. Congratulations on being number one in the What is it? What section are you in? I was just looking at this.
Oh, it's political philosophy.
You're
that it?
number one in media and internet in politics.
Boom.
You're killing it on Amazon. I guess people, no one's buying paper anymore. Maybe
And
we're
that's
not
far
even
out because
cutting trees anymore.
I'm telling people to buy it at this place called Red Emma's, which is this independent
I
bookstore.
love Red Emma's.
Yeah. So like don't buy it on Amazon. We're boycotting Amazon. But I will say if the numbers that's great.
Yeah.
Because that means because plenty of people are telling me that they're buying it independently. And if the numbers are still decent on Amazon, that's awesome. People seem to have some interest in the book. That's cool.
Red Emma's should do a, number one sold this week on the internet. And they have a cafe. For those who've never been to Red Emma's in Baltimore, have you been to the actual store?
I've actually never been to the actual store. I'm buddies with the guy who owns it. He actually he came to our Philly live show. And we've hung out a little bit, but I've never had the privilege. I was going to go do a reading there, but now we don't go places anymore.
No, we don't. You could do a
We
virtual
don't do
reading.
things anymore.
We don't. We just stare at our webcams all day long if we have one, drink on Zoom, and sometimes people jump in on our Zoom calls naked or, doing other
Has that
shit
happened to
like
you?
porn. It hasn't. We started to do passwords, but we don't have a password on this one, so who knows what's going to happen. Maybe someone will jump into our Zoom call.
Jesus Christ. They have done that to you?
No, they've done it to other people. I've been reading about it. So
yeah. I've been reading about it too. Yeah, it's horrible.
I heard about a guy who's running for Congress who did a town hall and they jumped in on their Zoom.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So some of them are horrible and some of them are pretty funny. That's actually funny.
No. Somebody did porno on a town hall, and it was a predominantly Muslim community. So you can imagine how horrifying that was. Yeah.
It's still a little funny though, on some level.
I think it's like intellectual dark web version 5. Is that no? I don't know.
No, it's more fun.
So in intellectual dark web, this is my kombucha. For those of you who are listening as a podcast, I'm drinking on camera. Not hard kombucha, but it makes
We've
me
seen
feel
you
like I'm
drink on
drinking
camera.
one.
I've been with you at debate nights. You're like, Michael, hot. Because Andrew Cuomo is because they got with the members of the IDC. Hold on, Sam. There was the IDC, and they were there, and they set a whole parameter for the debate you're seeing right now.
And
Let me get another drink.
let me get another spiked water, because that's all that's in that
spiked
studio.
water.
It's
Another
like rubbing alcohol in water.
0.2 alcohol percent.
I am a lightweight. You're giving it
Fermented
away.
guava.
I definitely bring those into the studio. All right. So you have this book. It's great. It's about the intellectual dark web. I have just started reading it as of last night. Not very far in because it's really hard to focus right now. Are you feeling that way too? Just in general?
It honestly, it goes in and out. I mean, sometimes it's extremely hard. Other times I am taking, like, there is some time to have more quiet and read books and whatever. So there is some of that going on. But obviously, I mean, no, of course. I mean, yeah, of course it's hard to, there's a lot cooking right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And Twitter's not helping because
Twitter's not helping. Twitter is trash.
It is total trash.
Twitter
I'm ready. I'm ready to like break up with Twitter, but I know it's too powerful of a tool, especially if you're selling a book. So tell me, okay. I really don't know a lot about the intellectual dark web. I'm aware of it because I live on the YouTubes, but I don't interact with it. And any experience I've had interacting with it, it's been because of Fox News. So it's not even like legit, intellectual dark web. Meaning like the Ben Shapiro's of the world. I know he's not technically, or maybe
he is technically part of it. Yeah.
I've debated him. He's an asshole.
Oh, really?
Like you needed to know that. Breaking news, guys. Yeah. He is an asshole.
Are you telling me that you had a heart that talking to Ben Shapiro was somehow not pleasant?
Well, some of them.
That's shocking.
They're assholes on TV. And then the minute the camera's off, they're genuinely like nice people. Some of them. Yeah,
but I mean, not
like Andrew Breitbart was like that.
Yeah, but not him. I mean, come on.
No, not.
There's no way that kid is like pleasant.
No.
I mean, to be fair to him, like I think he's got a very coherent personality. I don't think there's any difference. I would suspect, like he's just gonna do that little motor mouth thing no matter what. I liked going on like really like when I was going on like I-24.
Oh yeah.
They would have me like occasionally I would get like, and actually I forget the guy's name, but he was some like British, like right wing, like pro-Israel guy. We had an Ilhan Omar debate and I kicked his ass. And he was actually like really, but it was funny. Like he definitely was like, it would be like 50-50. Like he was legit in the sense that he had the accent, he knew how to whatever. And the other people that they had on, like I started joking, like I don't care, it's pretty much done. But like I would joke to the bookers. I was like, all right, like Trump did something, I don't like it, and there's somebody who like escaped from an institution who does like a public access cable show who really digs it, and we're gonna debate. Like,
oh my god, no!
And I remember I loved.
And now they're like the communications directors for the White House.
Right, that was the thing. That's true. That's true. I definitely did. There were a couple of them that I'd look up after because I mostly had no idea who they were.
Right.
And it was like one or two I looked up after, and I was just like, "Oh my god, that person has like a real position."
My favorite we're so off topic, but my favorite was the weather girl from Fox News Weekends Mornings. She is now the communications director for the Defense Department. And she's like, in news in Afghanistan, it's sunny today. Like, what the fuck is she? Wait, that's where they were casting the communications people. So any complaints you have about Bernie Sanders and his, non-traditional team, just look at the White House right now. I mean, they're running a full propaganda unit and it's working.
Right. Yeah, but he needs to do that on the other side.
Exactly.
Right? Like after like, all right, I'm president, and now, I mean, yeah. So, I don't even know what the Bernie equivalent of that would be. Actually,
it would be us on Twitter. It would just be all. It would be us. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what he's done, and you need fighters. You need people who can like take on Neera Tanden and not be afraid of her like army of trolls. So let's talk about what you're here to talk about, which is your book.
Yes. Well, and really whatever.
And anything. Yeah. But I want to know. I want to learn from you. I don't want to actually read the book. I just want to talk to you and pretend I know.
I knew that this was that hustle, basically. It's a very well-written book, though.
Okay, fine. I'll read it. If you do say so yourself, it's a well-written book.
It is. I do say so myself.
Okay, so this intellectual dark web, kind of a new thing, at least in labels, in terms of like, people who do not live on the internet, it's new. Why are these people so influential? When we were talking yesterday, we talked a little bit about how they're preying on a portion of the internet that would be susceptible to this? Maybe people who think they're more intellectual than they are, or like, explain to me, what is this mechanism?
Basically, what's interesting to me about these people, and no doubt, like when I got contracted to write this book, like they were popping. They were getting profiled in the New York Times. They were like all over the place. Jordan Peterson was like an actual international sensation.
Right.
Now this stuff is way, 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 way less on the map. But I think what's interesting to me about it is I start the book with like just a metaphor basically that I got from my friend Bhaskar Sankara, who founded Jacobin magazine, right? And he wrote in a piece, I think for the New York Times, where he was like, look, like not literally, but let's just take these three destinations as three different ways of doing politics. Let's say there's Hungary, which is like the resurgence, which we see more and more every day, of right-wing authoritarian politics. Then let's take Singapore, and Singapore is actually also pretty authoritarian. It's very market-oriented, but it's technocratic. It has a certain type of diversity. It values, it has a different way of doing things, right? And you could definitely see like Mike Bloomberg, Davos,
Right.
A lot of the people in the Democratic Party, this is the world that they idolize. This is the Fareed Zakaria world. And then he was saying, then there's like Finland Station. And Finland Station is where Lenin got back to basically like to go for before the 1917 Russian Revolution. Some people get really triggered by this. This is not like a big conversation about the Soviet Union or whatever, though that's an interesting conversation. But it's just the idea that that moment was a revolutionary moment. And the belief was, and I think this belief manifests in a variety of ways, whether we're talking about like the Workers' Party in Brazil or FDR or the African National Congress or 1917, this idea that like politics is really about expanding democracy into all spheres of life, including economic, right? That's a really simple way, I think, of kind of understanding a certain type of socialist viewpoint. And I think when you do have that kind of politics, you recognize that the world in terms of power right now is mostly a contest between Hungary and Singapore, and that Hungary is rising. And the interesting thing to me about the dark web was that it kind of is, because there is arguments inside of it, it covers a lot of Singapore style and Hungary style arguments for a popular audience. And I thought, really with the exception of what they don't have and what is more ascendant right now is this like, not in terms of policy, but like people who are doing like actual right-wing populism, that is in terms of economics, that is not in there. But you could look at like Sam Harris as a Singapore style guru for sure. And you could look at Jordan Peterson, who did meet with Viktor Orban and does have this real fixation with mythology and natural hierarchy, as a Hungry sort of figure. And so what I think all of these people do is they take, they try to either naturalize hierarchies through science or through mythology, right? So like we can't really challenge how the market works because that just is what it is, right? And if you're
it's an assumed truth.
It's an assumed truth. It's like oxygen. And so that's the kind of like where they're coming from. And I think in terms of the weaknesses that they were able to appeal to, though, is that particularly when they were rising on the scene, the left was mostly associated in people's minds with just kind of like a narrow moralism, like, hey, don't say that, don't do that, that's not cool, blah, 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 without a kind of like more full, either compelling dynamic of argument of how we actually want things to be, or a big, broad set of answers for everybody. Right? Like if you can come out of 2008
that's right.
For several years and primarily not have like a big narrative that can actually speak to the crisis most people are going through, that's a huge failing. And I think they're a manifestation of exploiting that weakness, and we can provide way more compelling answers. And the last thing I'll just say real quick is I think like the conclusion of my book is by far what I'm most excited about, because I'm not going to like, I felt like there was a time where I did videos about these people because it is in this YouTube space. It is in this, you know, it's in the air. They're still around. They're still popular. They still matter. I don't want to, like, I'm kind of bored by them. I think that it's important to understand them and get where they fit. I don't really care. I know that some people, you know, say that I'm unfair, blah, blah, blah. They'll do the usual kind of complaining. But I think the bigger thing here is like, these arguments that they present are going to be arguments that are going to be with us for a long time, whether or not it's them making it. And that this kind of like cosmopolitan socialist viewpoint that I'm putting forward, I think actually is a really good answer or framework for a left that is way more confident, way more appealing, way more global, and also really materially grounded in people's lives. So that's what I'm excited about. And that's definitely what I try to do on my show.
Well, it's interesting because I the way that I see this, and I've studied a lot about Roger Ailes and sort of how 2 generations ago he attempted to tap into that generation's version of the disaffected, disenchanted, white man who felt like the government was becoming too diverse, too focused on women, too big business, whatever it is. It's actually very similar to the Trump same base, basically. It's just, that's a base that turns out in votes, and in a Republican primary, it was disruptive enough to get him Trump the election. But for our generation, I think that their appeal this is their demographic, the way that they're going to be able to cling on to whatever version, whatever the right looks like moving forward in a country that is proving to be more and more populist, and our generation being more and more and younger, more and more populist, leftist, and just as you state, cosmopolitan, like literally actually cosmopolitan. More people are living in cities up until COVID. Who knows what's going to happen after this?
Yeah, who knows where people will go? Yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead.
So no, I'm just curious, like, what does cosmopolitan socialism mean for us moving forward? I mean, how does it look? What does it sound like? And how does it challenge these ideas that are not going away? They're just probably going to take another form with the next generation and the next technology and platform that allows them the ability to mobilize and speak out.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think that what's a little bit different about them is I think that part of it is like the through line of that kind of Roger Ailes thing for sure. But I think there's also a lot of there's a self-help element to it,
right,
which is really different and really relevant. I also think there's people like, look, a guy like Sam Harris is a Democrat. Like it is not, and that doesn't mean anything to me, right? Like that's not a big reflection of somebody's politics, but it is broader than just that kind of like traditional, we're right wing and we're going to find what's kind of bugging people right now to get them. And I also think like, and this will like pivot into your question really specifically. I'm also like of the school that like, okay, even if it's primarily appealing to young men and primarily appealing to young white men, so what? Right? Like
right.
That's like the kind of thing too that like I thought there was so much doors. Like if you were say in that demographic and you're 18 and you're reading around, I actually have an anecdote like this. I was at an event in Boise, Idaho, and there was this really cool kid who was driving me around from DSA, came and met me at the airport, whatever, and we started talking. He was a really, really smart, I shouldn't say kid, like a young man, really smart, really together person. And, his trajectory was like, yeah, I started getting interested in this sort of thing. It felt like, I could read some like piece about why like I shouldn't like Seinfeld or I sucked because whatever, and then I would look at like a conversation with Sam Harris or something, and they were talking about science and they were talking about different ideas, some of which are kind of interesting. And then maybe they were also now in retrospect promoting some politics I totally don't agree with, but it made a lot of intuitive sense. And then he said, and again, this just happened to be me. I think there's a lot of people like this. He found me and other kind of people. It was like, first was like, okay, you had really good debunks, but also like you were talking about my life. You weren't just saying like, oh, you're privileged, blah, 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 blah. You're talking about my student loans. You're talking about my healthcare. You're talking about my parents' retirement. You're talking about real shit. You're not just like giving another kind of like sort of simplistic, moralistic view of the world. And so I think like my specific angle with this like kind of like globalized view of socialism and a globalized answer is that there's sort of like these two tendencies right now that are really showing up, and they kind of cut across right and left. And one is this idea that like there are not universals. There really are only like culturally mediated experiences, and we cannot have common bonds beyond them. And it's funny because in the United States, I think a lot of people associate, like, there is a certain type of woke argument that really makes this case. And it gets really like, I just had this woman, Joanna Vista, on my shows, like talking about how really important research and disparity studies have been weaponized in the policy process in the last decade to undermine things like Medicare for all. Like it's literally undermined absolutely necessary policy efforts, right? And then even way more dangerously, we see like Hungary, and we see this kind of like resurgent nationalism. And there's this Israeli intellectual who's writing like the new democracy has to be nationalistic. There cannot be universal standards. There only is the nation state, and the nation state defines its own community, period. Like that's it, right? So you got this like rising tendency. And in response to a lot of the people, and again, the dark web represents different things around this too, because there's definitely a lot of stuff that I consider to be anti-Muslim. There's definitely all sorts of very toxic racial and gender stuff from my perspective, no question. But these are also people who are to some extent holding a perverse view of the opposite, which is that like, yes, there are universal values, there are universal standards, and those things came from the West, basically, right? Like, so in this, and I'll loop it like this. In the 1990s, there was a really big argument with the so-called like Asian tiger countries, like countries like Malaysia and Singapore. And they would say, like, fuck you, we do human rights. We have a different conception of human rights because we're Confucian. So we don't just valorize the individual. And then Western critics would be like, you guys are full of it. You're obviously violating people's right to free speech or whatever. And everybody wants the same thing. And what Amartya Sen, who's a big influence on this book, who's this Indian economist, came forward and was like, both sides of this equation are wrong, in the sense that like 100% there are universals. And if we don't have an ability to build universals, there's also going to be no left project, because the only way labor could ever confront power is with masses of people. And if you can't build serious bonds, not just with like shared moral commitments or shared ways of talking, that is always going to be really small. You need to build something out much bigger, much more inviting, and much more aggressive. And then on the other hand, what San said was where the Western chauvinists are wrong is that let's actually read everybody and look across the world. And of course we can find in Confucianism or in Islam or anywhere the building blocks of open societies, freedom of speech, holding power accountable, whatever, inquiry. And even when we get into like, what is the West? Like, that's bullshit. Greece, what was ancient Greece included was African, it was Pan-Asian, particularly by the time we get to Rome. So what I'm trying to say actually is one, it's like the answer to these guys is like, yes, there is like this compelling global experience we can have that really enlarges our perspective. It doesn't shrink it. It doesn't get us into these narrow arguments. It actually really widens the lens. And it's a much more exciting way of being in the world. And I think, and then what answers to them and also coalesces with building that serious socialistic, anti-racist, and globalized movement is this idea that we literally have to cross-pollinate across boundaries. We have, like, when I do histories on my show of like, we just did 2 parts on Samara Machel, who was this Mozambican revolutionary. There's a relevance in things that he put across to 2020 right now where we are, 100%. And not like a stretch, like, oh, I can see how that. It's like, no, like very direct parallels. So we can start to be this way. And I think that, it also provides a way more compelling way of taking on this stuff than being woke. Because instead of essentializing, instead of policing, instead of like narrowing the scope, you're actually really widening it. So that's
Absolutely.
what I'm trying to do.
And that's kind of, you and I have had this conversation offline quite a bit, our allergy to woke culture. And it's ironically triggering for a lot of people who identify as DSA members and are democratic socialists of our generation who live in these cosmopolitan, cities. They live in New York. There's several chapters of DSA in New York. And oftentimes, if they're in the electoral groups, it kind of the electoralism gets distracted by the need to create the appearance of being woke because it is a tool of organizing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Meaning the way that electoral politics works in America is, okay, we need to make sure that the African American base over the age of 60 shows up, or else we don't win. We need to make sure that the Latino neighborhood turns out. And so suddenly the language of electoralism is not so much about what you're saying, opening and broadening the base, but about basically micro-targeting and finding people that represent those neighborhoods and represent traditional political language for older voters who may not necessarily digest, intersectional, economic, whatever type of language you have. So, I mean, this is, the reason I asked about the cosmopolitan side of this is how in an era where we are trying to organize our generation, which is still, is falling into wokeness, which is not a new thing. This has happened, like you just said, throughout history. Identity has been thrown out there as a weapon or putting factions against each other, whatever it is, wherever somebody's from. But I think like our struggle as being, millennials and younger, being the largest and most diverse generations in history, who are dealing with an extraordinary economy and just likely to get much, much worse. How is it that we can, number one, stay in solidarity, but then also appeal to older demos the way that Bernie Sanders wasn't able to, because he was trying to speak to our generation, but he couldn't at the same time speak to an older generation that just is not there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a lot there. To me, it's like, no, it's good. I think, first of all, I think a lot of this like woke stuff, what's interesting to me, like, I think it's actually extremely narrow and extremely American and speaks to extremely small demos.
Yeah.
So I would make, and this is what I'm trying to do here, is like, I think on one hand, what has really been lost, and actually people were constantly talking about like, oh, Bernie Sanders needs how to learn how to do this, needs how to learn to do that. And there was some truth to that at times, which I'll get to in a second. But it's like, everybody needs to learn how to do what actually he did fantastically, which is speak in clear, moral, and obvious narratives about things that affect 99% of people.
Exactly.
And you need to do that. That's the material ground of it. There is a part that is like, and I've talked with Adolf Reed about this, like, mm-hmm. You can't, the part where it's like the distinction between like, okay, we're going to do an action, we're going to work on something. Obviously, if somebody shows up to a meeting and is like saying all sorts of like bigoted things and they can't sit next to somebody because they're from a different background or whatever, that's not going to work. You literally can't work from that base. Now, on the flip side, maybe somebody's going to come to a meeting and they're not trained in all of the various speaking patterns that you're used to. Maybe they have a different set of cultural preferences. Maybe they don't accept, like, they can accept like the very clear broad base of like opposing sexism or racism, but maybe they don't agree with all of your specific attunements and your very narrow definition of what that actually means. Mm-hmm. So I think on one part, there's actually just like getting back to really simple, like, look, if you go home and watch and listen and do whatever the hell you want, as long as you're like not hurting anybody, and then we'll do politics together. And it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what your cultural practices are. Like, I actually think there needs to be just some real, like, getting totally out of like, this is not a social club.
Right.
It's actually literally not a safe space, because I'll even just like take it at face value. Like, that's cool. If you want to generate that, then generate that. That's a different activity. Like create a small support group with a small group of people who are working through something together. That's totally valid. That's not politics. So I think that's one part of it.
And it's easy. I mean, I have to say, like, it's a very cheap way of dealing with politics. I think a lot of folks can get quick, easy wins on the internet through being provocative with woke and cancel culture, because it's an easy way to work through your enemies. It's an easy way to mobilize people, but it's not going to deliver you the long-term wins that we all need.
And it's not real wins. Like, it might be a win
wins,
for like a career advancement or whatever, but it's not appealing to a broad set of people, and it's literally not a win. I mean, like, this is what I'm saying. Like, even stuff that's actually more like real but difficult. Like, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe with COVID, maybe we're entering something different. But that period of weeks where people were saying like, oh, well, Bernie lost, but 60% of people support single payer. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He lost. That's literally the only thing that mattered. So don't tell yourself a bedtime story. We have to figure out what the problem was and how. And I think the next two parts here that I want to say that are related to that question, though, is like on another area where I don't care about the terminology. Like, I don't think cosmopolitan socialism is something to throw around for a whole bunch of people. But the attitude I'm talking about is well, number one, okay, so let's go back to Bernie. Bernie's coalition needs to be way more diverse. 100% correct, no doubt. Well, first of all, let's frame it as an addition and not a subtraction, because we don't want to lose what was already built. That's how because we're trying to like win.
Which he did, by the way.
Right. Which he did. And that's a major problem. Exactly. And then secondly, what are the actual strategies and literacies to actually do that? Because then it becomes like, well, if your task is to appeal, like, let's just take it in a hypothetical direction. If I need to persuade my grandmother in Long Island to vote for Bernie Sanders, I am not going to hire or talk to, like a 22-year-old, like anti-Israel Jewish activist from Swarthmore. Like,
right.
So then that was the second part. It's like, even when it's true, then what are we actually doing here? And then that brings me to the third part, which to me is really paradoxical. And I always find like kind of funny with my show, because like I'm very willing and increasingly just totally intolerant of this kind of like identitarian bullshit in the Adolf Reed terminology. And then at the same time, it's like I actually see so many conversations where it's just like, I think calling the black vote is actually really problematic. I think it's totally inaccurate. It literally, and this is a favorite word, erases a massive amount of distinctions of geographic, ideological, and economic diversity inside one of the most important dynamic communities globally, not just in the United States. So then all of a sudden to have a dynamic where like a whole bunch of cynical Democratic Party operatives who will use this discourse for a day and they'll throw it out tomorrow, they don't give a fuck. Mm-hmm. They will make it that, well, all the black vote is African Americans over 60 in South Carolina. That's it. It is certainly not an immigrant from Trinidad and Brooklyn. It is certainly not a labor union organizer in Wisconsin. It is definitely not, somebody who has like a small chain of businesses in Southern California, or maybe it is, depending on who they're contributing to. But it's definitely this one very specific slice. And then that's cynically wielded against Bernie. And then on the flip side, yeah, there is this other discourse of like, right, that does need the approach needs to be different. And therefore, like, okay, but who, like, obviously, like, Nina Turner's an incredible campaigner, and Bernie did bring in people that were really amazing. In fact, one of the things that frustrates me is I actually see a lot of this from outside of the campaign itself, even. But I see people who didn't even support Bernie, and definitely people around Warren and elsewhere, is sort of like, well, X, Y, and Z needs to be done, but we actually are totally not the ones to do it.
Right.
And we don't have the discursive strategies. We don't have, so, it's like.
Yeah, the Warren facade of like, they kept saying, oh, you keep erasing all these diverse, women who've supported Warren. It's like, no, those were the diverse, notable women who supported Warren. On the actual voting side, it was a bunch of white, wealthy, highly educated people that are New York Times, readers, and that's it. Like, they won the New York Times.
That's like literally
audience.
it. Like, including like more men when you like broke down the. So I think, like, to me, this attitude that I'm talking about would actually really get into way more intricacy. I think it would both at the same time try to historicize things and try to look at things in a more like less moralistic and more economic and political lens. And then on the other hand, it actually would say like, it isn't just sufficient to have like a strategy for this or that group.
Right.
It's actually like, you better fucking understand something about this or that group,
Right.
both in their own terms and also how it relates to a broader experience. Because that's the funny thing to me about so much of those discourses is that they actually they're really essentializing the ways that we reject as from like a socialist position, but they're also just like, they erase in their own terminology so much nuance and so many things that are necessary to properly communicate a message and also build things in peer-to-peer relationships. Because the last thing I'll say, like you see, absolutely there's people who like totally bitch and complain about the South Carolina vote in ways they 100% should not. They reveal a lot of nonsense when they say it, no doubt, right? I totally agree with that. And then there's other people that are like, well, because it's the South Carolina, like you can't talk about it, which is also totally ridiculous. And then other people even use, and we started to see this like in 2017, like literally white people like tweeting like gifs of or you know memes of like you know black women going to vote, like almost as if all these bizarre, and they are mostly boomer liberal white people, it's like they are essentializing it to make it, it's like this isn't Green Mile, this is the country.
That's what
and it's actually really offensive and really it's horrifying. So
it was an emblem. I was like 100%. I wanted to say, you know, and many of my good friends were those women who were diverse, great activists, by the way, have great reputations for the work that they do in their communities. And I legitimately think they wanted a woman that was leaning progressive. And maybe they didn't get phone calls from Bernie Sanders, which is his own issue, is that he's not very good at the politics and the outreach. You know, we're humans and people like to get personal phone calls. So I hear them on that sense. But with that being said, the entire campaign was like, you know, it was like an emblem for the white wealthy woman, possibly former Hillary voter, most likely, who was feeling guilty and wanted to look like she had a bunch of, you know, women of color as friends. And this is what were their ways of making up for it.
Yeah,
in the 2016 election. Because they also painted that narrative. Sorry, just a side note.
No, go ahead.
The narrative about blaming white women for Donald Trump was also completely false. I mean, it was white men who were wealthy that won him the election. And in several cases, their wives or partners voted with them, which is completely congruent with all historical trends, not just 2016. What lost Hillary the vote, let's just say over and over again, was the fact that she did not engage working people. She lost people who made under $45,000 a year. She didn't show up in places like Philadelphia, which is a stronghold for Democrats. She didn't show up in places like Wisconsin, as we know. And at the end of the day, it didn't have to do with all of these identity, you know, they tried to blame it on identities. You know, it blamed the white woman and black women show up. They do, sure. But guess what? Nobody did under $45,000 a year in the Democratic Party at the rates that she needed to. And that's what she didn't want to address. So it becomes an excuse, as you know, and in a way.
No, I think I love it. And I think like what's also right is just is actually coming at it from both directions, which is either like, let's just take the top lines and realize that this is just a really simplistic, misleading way of understanding what happened electorally, or let's go in the opposite direction and really get into the intricacies of what we're talking about here. Because even like just the discourse, like, look, I don't care. You want to talk about like the privilege of white men or whatever, that's fine. And there's obviously relative truth to it. It's fine. I think, I think it's a little bit 2014, but I think, but there's truth to it. Of course, there's no doubt. Nobody would deny it. There's truth to that. And at the same time, like a discourse that would suggest that somebody, in Akron making $18,000 a year is privileged,
right?
Because their name is Bob Smith and they're a straight white guy, is like, it's insane. Like, it's not just wrong, it's like demented. And I think the other thing that is important to look at here, and this is another parallel I want to draw with Adolph Reed, because Adolph Reed then, first of all, he also talks about the problem with like the brokerage role then. If you make if you make demographics and different populations like not just human beings with specific histories and specific trajectories, but like magical things that need to be understood, then then it becomes like not politics. It becomes like, okay, I need to like have somebody that can understand the secret psychology of like the Jewish electorate or whatever, versus just like, yes, of course, you need people, you need to hire people from different backgrounds, and you need people who are literate and competent across the board, but there isn't like these magical keys that take different groups of people outside of history, right? And I think like the other thing that I wanted to note that I really got from Adolf Reed was like, if you go to the 1990s, and of course it's not the same, like the damage is not the same, but it's fascinating to me because if you look at the 1990s, we all know Republicans did this, but Democrats were all over this. Like, we would say, yes, there's poverty and crime in urban America because of deindustrialization, because American apartheid basically ended like 40 years ago legally, and there has been nothing systemically to adjust that at all. Not only has there been nothing systemically to adjust that, as soon as it started like legally started to come down, we basically start gutting America's social infrastructure. So of course, we're going to go into the 1990s and there's going to be problems, right? But everybody, the New Republic, everybody was all over like, oh, you know, and Bill Clinton, the cultures of poverty, and you know, it's not because of all the obvious things. It's because of rap music, like all of this shit. Now most people kind of understand that if they don't really want to talk about it, but most people understand that was super racist, very embarrassing and pathetic. Now, it is not the same thing, because there's no doubt that the stakes of anti-African American racism is completely different. And I wouldn't even call it like anti-white rhetoric is not racist in the same sense. We all understand that. But if we were to look at this stuff just as like, forget the content, let's just say we're like playing a game or we're writing a screenplay, you know, like you get a book like about how to write a screenplay, and it's like, you know, it's like, hey, whether you're writing like Beverly Hills Cop or fucking Field of Dreams or whatever, it's all the same structure, right? All of the shit that you see coming out from like woke stuff to explain the Trump electorate is the same narrative structure as the stuff about poverty in the 90s. It's all, these people are just, they just don't get it. They've got bad morals. They don't know how to work. And then of course it's, you know, totally layered with the same thing you were talking about earlier, which is like, well, I can feel good about myself because I'm not one of these other, you know, terrible white people that's a racist. I have to say, as much as I'm like rejecting identitarian politics, there isn't a single trajectory of bad politics that doesn't start from affluent suburban white people or urban white people. So you have this whole other dynamic, and nobody's looking at even the material base of the Trump vote. Someone made this, I'll be real quick, someone made this great point to me, like, even in like these, okay, say you're in some depressed little town in Maine, there's no jobs. Yeah, probably you don't have it's very possible you don't have super enlightened attitudes. But you're also going to a Trump rally because the person who owns the quarry, which is maybe the only place in town where you can get a job, is going to be at that rally. Your minister probably is, which is the only social cohesion group. And then who else? The cop chief and the fire chief, in case anything goes down, you know? Yeah. You don't want to get a fucking ticket for driving drunk. Like, even that has a material base. And I think people need to just really unlearn, particularly in America, and definitely liberals, stop looking at like these moral narratives of why things happen. That's usually not where things start.
But we have to assume that we're all on the same page and we all have the same goals on the liberal side. And I am just of the mindset that the people who are churning out this rhetoric, these narratives, which, you know, is Center for American Progress, as we know very well. They have a very they're extremely influential when it comes to establishing these narratives with Neera Tanden in 2016, and the Women's March, the people who jumped on board with the Women's March as it started to grow, not the initial founders, were pushing for this rhetoric as they wanted to broaden their coalition of blaming white women, and all these things might be true, that white women were partially responsible and white men, but at the end of the day, it is not going to help us win. I mean, we know that blaming voters does not do anything to engage those voters the next time around, but there's a lot of money to be made in this type of rhetoric, not just money to be made in the industry of selling this propaganda, this bullshit, these narratives, but also just, the clicks. It's clickable, content on the internet. It's something that you could put on news shows all day long on the cable news. And it's something that if you're running for office, it's a great way for you to raise money. And that leads me to this question about AOC, because I respect AOC. I supported her. I live in that neighborhood normally I do. Right now I'm in Arizona. And I'm a little worried, like the whole Joe Rogan debacle was revealing, because I feel as if she may not be, and I'm only using her as an example because everybody knows who she is and follows every bit of information out there, that she's not broadening her base enough for somebody who is, number one, cosmopolitan, number two, represents a district that she won the white vote war with. She didn't win. She did not win the black vote. She did not win the Latino vote. She won the white vote, the educated white vote. So she was speaking that language to a woke audience. But the groups that we need to build, we're not buying into that rhetoric. They were buying into, whatever it was that establishment rhetoric. I have no idea it was low turnout elections. So
no, I think look, I don't know. I want to give her a lot of the benefit of the doubt, like you do. But I also think, specifically if the reporting about her being upset that Bernie Sanders' campaign heralded the Joe Rogan endorsement is true, that's a really big problem. Mm-hmm. And I think, that's actually a really great distilled example of okay, first of all, in the terrain of the world, particularly in politics, you're going to have to deal with, build coalitions with, and work around people you have disagreements with. Mm-hmm. Secondly, Joe Rogan is, and I'm not a big, I'm not excited about deplatforming and all of that, but even if you were, it's just irrelevant. The View is disgusting. And by the way, the View is infinitely more damaging to the prospects of working people than Joe Rogan ever is. Joe Rogan has way more concern for people's well-being than anybody on the View. So let's be very clear about that. Mm-hmm. But I'm not saying cancel the View. The View is there.
Yeah.
The View is there. It's part of the landscape. Joe Rogan is there. It's part of the landscape. So the idea that the response to the most popular podcaster, YouTube person on earth, mm-hmm. with millions and millions and millions and millions of people, to tune it out,
right,
or not herald it, that's just, again, it's just not, it's just anti-politics. I can't indulge that for a second. And thirdly, I also think it's really important. It's I'm saying that principle applies to something like The View, which I think is absolutely disgusting and has very few redeeming qualities. Mm-hmm. Whereas Joe Rogan has plenty of redeeming qualities, right? He does. If you watch it, he's spoken out. Look, there's a reason he supported Bernie Sanders. He's got plenty of redeeming qualities. But I'm saying, he is the new center. That's the center. That is, and in fact, he's part of the dark web thing.
Wait. This is just a side. I think I told you this. My aunt, who watches The View, was citing CDC statistics from the Joe Rogan show to me, and I was like, "This is really fascinating." As a political scientist, a wannabe political scientist, is listening to her articulate where she's getting her information from The View, and that's why she supports Biden.
Yep.
But also from Joe Rogan. It was mind-blowing.
Joe Rogan is the center. And again, even if you look at he's interviewed sympathetically plenty of people I hate. He's interviewed sympathetically people I love, Cornel West, Bernie Sanders. And the way he usually comes down on politics, even when is interesting. Because again, I would really be very clear that mostly, not always, but mostly, the objection is going to be on tone, style, and discourse stuff, and almost never what he's actually saying. So his actual sort of policy sets. Now, so
where does that go with AOC? In terms of her platform, how do we make sure this generation is not falling for the same, it's the same mistakes, frankly, over and over again.
Yeah.
And I think if you're coming from New York City, cosmopolitan, you're more vulnerable to making these mistakes in politics because of the way electoral politics works in major cities where most young people are living right now.
Well, I'd want to make the way I want to use that word, because that word means so much, so many things that suck, but part of me resonates with it, is actually just somebody who is really able to move and translate between very different environments. So I think that if somebody can, you know, do diplomacy in the Middle East, talk to Joe Rogan, you know, go to an Audre Lorde festival and then a Knick game, that's cosmic. Like, you know, is like I think having a real broad ability to have a certain type of empathy and a certain type of intellectual fluidity, as well as really understanding in a socialist sense, just the obvious shared bonds when it comes to the economy, which drives everything, right? So I think the thing, I mean, look, AOC and the broader movement and environment around her, I just think ultimately needs to decide, like, AOC can be a super successful, you know, and dynamic congressperson who represents a district and represents a certain constituency, and that can be fine. That's important. There's people who play that role. I see a lot of people wanting her to be a state and national figure. I think in terms of her talent, in terms of her tenacity, she could be. That's my read. She has a huge amount of talent as a political figure. My problem and concern is like, she's unpopular if you look at the poll numbers. And, you know, I know
nationally unpopular.
She's unpopular. Of course, look, has Fox News been trashing her? Is there a media war? Absolutely. No doubt about it. And at the same time, people should also recognize that she also gets a fair amount of favorable coverage, and she's also has a massive independent platform. And so it's not just because she's getting demonized. It's not just because there's reactionary politics. It's because the way she's messaging and the way she's talking right now is not a national message. And it's not me for me to say. I don't know what the intention is. I don't know what the goal is. But if people want her to be a presidential contender or a Senate contender, then they need to start really radically rethinking not the policy positions, but the messaging and what's actually coming across. Because the messaging right now is for a very narrow subset. And the last thing I'd say too is I think is another really big mistake that the left makes, that I can't believe they're still making, which is, and it comes up all the time in AOC discourse. Yes, she's got a certain credibility with her base. By the way, I would say she needs to watch that credibility, particularly on things like foreign policy.
Very much so.
You know, and that's just being real and stop standing and stop canceling people in general.
That's right.
I'm so fucking sick of that. Everybody are really like, there's very, 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 very few people, including people who've made big mistakes, who deserve to be like excommunicated or whatever. Like even Elizabeth Warren is somebody like, I want her to be punished politically, but I don't want her to like not be able to make a living or whatever, right?
We can't talk about restorative justice on one hand and cancel people for bullshit on the other hand.
And cancel
empathy is universal.
Absolutely. And by the way, even things where people have made actual legitimate mistakes and are changing.
I mean, look at those remember the South Carolina shootings in the church. The families in that church who got up days afterwards and said, we pray for this person. And, you know, our church doesn't teach us to demonize and to punish in, you know, ways. We want this person to grow. I'm not saying the person's name because, you know, we know, but that is the politics I think that we all on the left, that's our core. But it gets lost along the way. And so I think there's a lot of
I totally agree. It becomes like a religious cult. And the thing is, like, I look at that and it's not for me to say at that level. Obviously, we can't say what anybody's reaction could be. But I look at that and I think that's the ideal. That's actually what we should be working towards and certainly reflect. And then on the flip side, I like AOC. I'm going to criticize her, and people need to not have fucking whiny meltdowns when I say she's had trash positions on Venezuela. She's been shaky on any number of issues. So I guess I just end with, okay, but I'll say this real quick. People on the left are so stuck in their heads that the only thing that needs to be reconciled is like essentially people who are, I guess, identify as socialists, but basically kind of like beefed up liberals. and then like other kinds of liberals. And so they look at AOC and they go like, oh, she endorsed Bernie, but they like her on The View.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not like, that isn't even a majority of the Democratic Party electorate. So I think there's a really big problem that people still don't seem to get, that the playing field is much, much bigger than they realize. And I don't want to make, and I think the Democratic establishment is very comfortable with that frame, because they really basically just want people to be like, look, you've got absolute troglodytes who vote for Trump, and they're all just undifferentiated, massive evil, and there's nothing even to talk about. We certainly have nothing to do with the economy or anything else. And then you have all of us. And like, sure, like we've got our disagreements and gaping holes in life experience, but we're all just generally the good people. And that's not what it is. Like inside the Democratic electorate, I think you could think of maybe like 4 or 5 or 6 electorates inside the Democratic Party. And people are still really fixated on this idea that like, oh, well, AOC, she would get the Warren people and the Bernie people. Guess what? The Warren people and the Bernie people are about 35%, 37%.
That's right.
So talent and capacity wise, I'm sure she's there. But if she and they want it to be national, a little bit more Bernie 2016.
That's right.
And a little bit, more of a kind of much broader message. And even I would say when you're talking about, other areas, like I think the discourse should reflect wanting to reach a much broader set of people.
Yeah. And I think building coalitions, just as we wrap it up right now, I noticed this in the beginning, we all have to navigate our political worlds, and New York is just a cesspool of corruption left and right, and you still have to deal with the lawmakers in your district. And it doesn't mean that you partnered with them on things. And I think that's what concerns a lot of folks, is bringing in staff that have experience needed on the left. We don't have experience on the left because we're not a large enough universe yet. We haven't had enough people elected, and it's a new, it's a movement that's growing, and a lot of young people are involved that don't have experience, but doesn't mean that you go and you bring in people from Kamala Harris's office who may not have the same morals. I feel like we could talk about this forever. I have so many other points. My only point I'm going to throw out at the end is there's a lot of money in this. There's a lot of money in being provocative. There are a lot of Twitter followers. That does not translate to movements being built. It's the only time I'll ever say, because it helped me in my race, my Twitter following, but it helped me raise the money. It helped me recruit volunteers. It helped me get on the ballot. It helped me get on the debate stage. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to get our messages out to communities that don't naturally hear them, and make sure that message is relatable to all, which is, I think, the point of your show, and really the message that you put out there every day. So, Michael, thank you.
Thank you.
Book is at where are all the places we can buy Against the Web?
Well, you can buy it
to the new right.
You can buy it everywhere, and I would buy it at Red Emma's in Baltimore.
Yes, and when they're back open, definitely go there. It's they have an amazing restaurant, bookstore. Spend hours there. It's great.
I love it.
Michael, come back.
Of course.
Or come to Arizona. I mean, we're going to build a commune here. I don't think you guys know. We're building a leftist media commune here.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare. I've already told you how I feel about this idea.
There's a pool.
I like the pool part.
It's from the 60s.
The pool part is good.
I built a studio that's not occupied like 3/4 of the time, so you can come here and do your show. You can even change the lights behind.
I like all the rest of it. All the rest of it. This commune thing.
I don't know. It's just, what else are we going to call it? It's like when the Silicon Valley guys went up to those houses in Silicon Valley and lived there for like 4 months to build their, and like lived off of Adderall and pizza and built their apps.
That also doesn't sound fun.
No, it sounds horrifying.
No, Miki, I am going, if you put me in charge of the selection process, be extremely hard to get into.
Yes. We only have a few rooms, so.
Yes, that's right. Space is limited.
Space is limited and food's limited. So if you can cook, even better.
We'll weight your application that way.
We'll weight your application. All right.
All right. Thanks a million.
Michael, thank you. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Stay home. Okay. Take care.
I will.
So I did not sleep well last night. Hate to break it to everyone. That's why I'm looking a little pale today. I didn't sleep well last night because my Twitter alerts were waking me up. I'll just leave that there. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But, you know, luckily I was able to eventually get to sleep and get a couple of hours of shut eye because I use Sunset Lake CBD. Sunset Lake CBD has been my go-to sleep aid for a bit now. Basically, you know, I learned about them from Sam Cedar. Sam Cedar was raving about CBD. I was like, I think it's a scam because I had tried some, you know, from some like bodega that I spent $100 on. And he's like, no, you got to try Sunset Lake. And then I did, and he was right. It really, really helped. I started with the gummies. I then got addicted to the gummies. So now I've weaned off the gummies, but you should definitely try the gummies. But I use the CBD oil. I drop a little bit in my water or my tea at night. The CBD oil now comes with melatonin, so it'll help you go to sleep and stay asleep. The CBD helps you stay asleep. Unfortunately, I didn't do it at the beginning of the night. I had to do it midway through the night around 5 o'clock in the morning, which is real fun. But luckily, I have the product. Sunset Lake CBD is a farmer-owned company that ships craft CBD products directly from their farm in Vermont that used to be a dairy farm, a Ben and Jerry's dairy farm. They decided to diversify it, and now they grow premium hemp, and they send it right from their farm to your door. They take care of their workers. And when you take care of them, they're supporting and enhancing their rural economy because rural economies, unfortunately, are not supported, as we know. But Sunset Lake CBD is doing everything they can to make sure that the community that they support in Vermont is completely supported through having a $15 minimum wage, having their employees own the majority of their company. And then on top of that all, they give back to independent shows like ours and the David Pakman Show. And of course, the Majority Report. You can go to sunsetlakecbd.com today and you will get 20% off of your order. If you type in Nomi, N-O-M-I, go to sunsetlakecbd.com, type in Nomi, and they've got all sorts of new products right now out there. You know, I've been hearing from folks who like the dog biscuits. I think it's something that if you've had small dogs in particular, they get really a lot of anxiety when you leave. And the dog biscuits help. They're also full of it's purely like natural ingredients. I think you can eat the dog biscuits if you want to. I think Sam Cedar may have at one point, but it totally chills out your dog if they get a lot of anxiety. Mine gets anxiety. He starts chewing on his. Oh, it's so sad. He chews on his own skin, and then he has to wear the little cone for a long time because he just does it. But the CBD has definitely helped him, and I know it's helped other people as well. Go to sunsetlakecbd.com, type in Nomi, N-O-M-I, and you will get 20% off of your entire order. And check out all the other sales. They have a ton of sales all the time with lots of interesting products. Go check it out, sunsetlakecbd.com. We just showed a clip of Senator Bernie Sanders talking with Bob Costa from Washington Post, and he was discussing how Senator Sanders, when he was nominated at the convention by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she was called out by NBC News for not saying Joe Biden's name. And it illustrated an example of how NBC, which does know the DNC's rules of nomination, tried to use the fact that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not say Joe Biden's name at the convention against her. And we were just discussing right beforehand, this is a perfect illustration of manufacturing consent, in which the corporate media surely knows how the DNC conventions work if they know anything. But they still wanted to pit progressives against centrists. So what do you think of that, just from the start?
Well, there's a clear conflict between the Democratic between the DNC, the Democratic National Council, and the liberal constituency. You can see it in the debates over the program.
Click the blue Add to Chrome button, then click Add Extension to continue.
Uh-oh, we have a little technical.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
We had a little bit of a technical glitch there. Go ahead, keep going.
Technical problem?
There's a pop-up sound, but I think it passed now.
I think so, yeah. It's what happens when we're doing this from home. So you're saying that there is a clear divide right now between the progressives and the centrists.
Very clearly in the program. So, for example, even between Biden and the DNC. So Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, both of them, each of them separately, said that they wanted to have to end subsidies for fossil fuel companies. That was part of the Democratic Party program. When the DNC management saw it, they cut it out. They're thinking about donors in fossil fuel donors in Pennsylvania and Ohio. So they cut out the program of their own nominee, not just Sanders and AOC, Biden and Harris. They cut it out at the last minute.
And they did it behind closed doors, which, it happened behind the scenes. It didn't happen with a vote. It surely didn't happen in front of any cameras. And it also happened while everybody was paying attention to this I guess, well-crafted convention. So, I mean, I guess what we're trying to figure out right now is if Joe Biden is elected and he takes office, and effectively he will take over the Democratic National Committee, are progressives going to be in worse shape in that the Democratic establishment, in terms of the movement pushing forward, the Democratic establishment will have the reins again? It's not like we're going to have an election over DNC chair anymore. Suddenly it will be Joe Biden's party. Center for American Progress will be in power again. All of the institutions that surround. How do you see this playing out?
It's very hard to say. There's not only a Democrat-Republican conflict, there's a conflict internal to the Democratic Party between the Clinton New Democrats, donor-oriented, Wall Street-oriented, and the base of the party, which is basically social democratic, wants to move on issues like healthcare, ending fossil fuels, so on. That's a conflict. Same one in the Labour Party in England. In fact, what you saw in England was a real power play when the parliamentary Labour Party, the Blair Party, along with the media, mass media almost uniformly, really destroyed the popular Labour Party. They destroyed Corbyn, who had turned the Labour Party into a participatory party with mass popular involvement. They couldn't take that. They killed it. If you take a look at that 800-page report that came out on shenanigans inside the Labour Party, you can see the extent to which they went to destroy the threat of a popular-based Labour Party. They wouldn't tolerate that, and they managed to destroy it, basically. And I think we're seeing something of the same conflict here. So, for example, the DNC and where they control the states were able to purge Sanders voters in 2016. They probably did it this time too. We haven't got the figures yet. But now we see it even more sharply because it's even between the Clintonite DNC establishment and their own candidate. That's one of them, actually, but went a little too far in threatening the donor class.
Professor Chomsky,
about American elections. American elections are bought. You can predict the outcome of an election for Congress or president with remarkable precision by just looking at campaign funding. Thomas Ferguson, well-known political scientist, has studied this over a century, and it's remarkably predictable. You have to laugh when people talk about Russian influence in the election, which is undetectable.
Right.
And what is not only detectable, but overwhelming, is simply the funding of elections by the corporate sector and private wealth. There's an overwhelming effect.
You know, over the last 45 years since the New Democrats and New Labor and really the consolidation of media, it's been very hard for progressives to build a movement. Of course, it's all broken apart with the internet and income inequality soaring. All the movements that have grown in the last decade or so. So, have you been surprised by how long the New Dems, the New Labor, have been able to stay around? The Bill Clintons of the world maintaining their power well after their presidency and control of the White House and the party.
They've pretty much controlled the same basic group has largely controlled the government since the country was founded. That's taking different forms at different times. Now, when there is an enormous popular upsurge of the kind that took place, say, in the 1930s, when the labor movement revitalized massive strikes, sit-down strikes, popular parties storming, demanding change, and a sympathetic administration, it yielded to their pressures. And you got the New Deal, and the United States moved to a mild level of social democracy. Mm-hmm. To recognize how remote the United States is from the major developed societies. So take the Sanders program, which is called in the press radical left. Okay, this is a radical left program. Two main planks. One is universal health care. Can you think of another society that has universal health care?
Several.
Can you think of one that doesn't have it?
Exactly.
But that's radical left in the United States. Really scary. The other major plank, there are only two, is free college tuition. It's everywhere. Mm-hmm. But to call for what's everywhere in the United States is radical left. You have articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post saying, maybe it's a good idea, but Americans just aren't ready for these radical left proposals that you have in every other country of the world. I mean, that's a sign of business power, enormous business power. Now, is the public opposed to universal health care? Of course not.
Right.
Take a look at, in fact, what happens when it comes up on the ballot is very interesting. I lived most of my life in Massachusetts, the most liberal state. Universal health care regularly came up on the state ballot, for a referendum in the state. Polls showed overwhelming support for it. Then you start getting the flood of ads. They're going to take your doctor away from you. Mm-hmm. You're going to have such huge taxes, you won't be able to buy food, pouring in, nice couples like Harry and Louise talking about how terrible our lives will be when we won't be able to see a doctor and the state will be controlling us and so on. You watch the polls, numbers decline, and finally it gets to a vote, it's voted down. That's business power, and you're not going to confront it inside the government. The only way you can confront it is by making people's power greater. Worked pretty well in England. 2017, Corbyn swept the elections, biggest vote that Labour had ever gotten. 2 years later, they killed him with a massive campaign claiming anti-Semitism. Right. Somebody said a critical word about Israel, they're Nazis and so on. And it was all over the media, all the way to the Guardian, the critical media.
Right.
And he's not a fighter. He just stood there and took the battering, and there was no answer. That was it. You're seeing another version of it now. And until there is a energized, active, engaged popular movement, it's going to be hard to combat. Thatcher and Reagan, or their advisors, knew exactly what they were doing when they came into office. First thing they did when they came into office, both of them, was crush the labor movement. Mm. That's critical. As long as you don't have an engaged labor movement, there isn't going to be a solid continuing base for progressive programs. So it's very important to kill the labor movement. Now, this was done, Thatcher did it by smashing the coal mine strikes. Reagan did it right away by bringing in scabs, which is illegal in every country in the world except South Africa at the time, bringing in scabs to break up strikes. As soon as the government did it, the corporations got the idea. They started doing it. Pretty soon you have what you have now, practically no labor movement. Then, of course, you have the courts, which are business run, of course, which institute what are called right-to-work laws. Mm-hmm. Right to work means right to steal. It means that a worker in a union can say, I want union protection, but I'm not going to pay dues. Mm-hmm. That's right to work. Takes real good propaganda to put the...
You're in Arizona, which is a right to work state right now, and if you look at the map back to the Reagan era and before, so much of this was empowered by the Koch brothers, which you know too well, and I think what's so interesting about their strategy is clearly the Republican Party demographics were shifting away from them. They had to start appealing to new voters or taking control of the power. So whether it's through actual challenging of incumbents or controlling the media, astroturfing, lobbying, redistricting, of course, later on. It seems like the Democrats, the new Democrats, the establishment Democrats are operating with the same tactics right now against progressives because the demographics are not in their favor, clearly. I mean, the ideas of Senator Sanders, the ideas of AOC and the Squad and so many other progressives that are now rising into power are really reflective of a generation of, millennials and below. And of course, working people who haven't been coming to the polls at the rate needing to win. So knowing that there's all this power around us, you have monopolized media, barely any investigative reporters left, barely any state house reporters left. The parties that are extremely concentrated towards corporate power. How can the progressive left, so many of who are new to this movement because they're younger, really fight off and not fall for the same tactics that they can fight back against moving forward? I mean, what tips would you have for younger people who are now part of this movement?
Keep at it. They've already had successes. Now the program of the Biden program was compelled by popular activism to move farther towards what's called the left, mild social democracy, than any previous program since Roosevelt. And it was done by constant activism. So, for example, on the most important issue of all, doing something about environmental catastrophe, the party didn't go far enough, but went way beyond the Clintonites, way beyond. The DNC didn't like it, but were forced to accept it. The program calls for $2 trillion of investment in something like a Green New Deal. It supports a Green New Deal, which is essential for survival. And it even called for advancing the date for net emission neutrality. Okay. Now, the next thing will be to see if they'll do it. It's one thing to put it on paper. It's another thing to implement. They're not going to do it on their own. Mm-hmm. They'll only do it if the same forces that made them write it on paper will keep their feet to the fire and make them implement it. And that's what young people can do. Keep banging at the doors. How did a Green New Deal ever make it to the legislative agenda? Okay. Sunrise Movement.
Right.
Group of young people who were not only agitating, but went to the point of taking over congressional offices, Nancy Pelosi's office. They got support from AOC, other young legislators who came in on the Sanders wave. There was a progressive Democratic senior senator, Ed Markey, he joined in, and they managed to put it on the legislative agenda. Now, the Democratic Party nominees have been compelled to accept it. DNC doesn't want it.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what happens. But that's the answer. Real politics is not pushing a lever once every 4 years.
Right.
That's what they try to tell you. The standard view of politics is take the leading public intellectual of the 20th century, Walter Lippmann, liberal. Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, liberal, one of the major writers on political philosophy. His position, was supported by many others, is the population are spectators, not participants.
Mm-hmm.
They're supposed to show up every couple of years, push a button, go home, let other people run things for them. That's the line. It's also the corporate line.
Mm-hmm.
Corporations are concerned, not just the DNC. Corporations are concerned with what they call reputational risk. They're starting to hate us. We're in trouble. Actually, domination is very thin. It's only by consent. People withdraw consent, the whole thing collapses. And they know it. And so you take a look at the Davos meeting last January. It's very interesting. Every January, as you know, the rich and powerful gather at a ski resort, fancy ski resort in Switzerland, Davos, and congratulate each other on how marvelous they are. CEOs, Hollywood stars, media figures, and so on, go skiing. This year was different.
Mm-hmm.
The theme this year was they're coming after us. We're facing reputational risk. We got to do something. So the line that they projected was, we've been doing wrong things. We know it. The last 40 years, we haven't been working for you the way we should be. But now we're reformed. We realize we made mistakes. We apologize. Now we're dedicated humanists. You can put your faith in our hands. We'll take care of you. We hear this periodically. In the 1950s, it was, we're going to be soulful corporations. Not just for money, we're going to be soulful corporations. Well, we had 60 years of that. Now we're going to be deeply humanitarian corporations. So just go home, put your faith in us, and push the lever, go home, be spectators, not participants. And we'll make sure that everything works properly for you because we're so dedicated to your welfare. Well, people can either accept that or not. If you don't accept it, keep hammering away, you make progress. That's how every positive change has ever taken place. The power doesn't give you gifts.
Right.
They grant you something that they're forced to.
Right.
When they can't have an alternative. J.P. Morgan Chase, biggest bank in the United States, a leaked memo appeared, a secret internal memo a couple months ago. It was warning that they have to stop their funding of fossil fuels because it's causing reputational risks. People are going to withdraw from this. Okay, that's the answer.
Yeah.
Until you manage to dismantle the system. It's a system that shouldn't exist,
right.
But we're not going to dismantle it by snapping a fist. It's going to take a lot of work.
Right.
Meanwhile, you can force it to accommodate your needs. Just as social democracy developed in Europe, just as the New Deal developed here, just as civil rights developed and women's rights, the environmental movement, anti-war movement, anything you can think of.
So, Professor Chomsky, before we wrap up, you were part of this letter that was addressing free speech, and it was, I think, interpreted in the public as a letter fighting back against what is now called cancel culture. And I'm curious because I know you've had to answer this question a lot, but cancel culture or the attack against folks for transgressions, past transgressions, apologized transgressions, or nothing at all, just plain old smears. It seems to have become a weapon of the powerful. I guess it's always been, but we're seeing it especially in this election. Alex Moore's campaign in Massachusetts right now against Representative Neal, and we see it with Shahid Buttar against Nancy Pelosi. There are many, many other races where they're using cancel culture, quote, to break apart campaigns, the momentum that they're gaining. Is this new?
What's happened is that segments of the left have taken up the standard procedures of the mainstream establishment, which are never discussed because they're just what you do to the left, you repress it. But segments of the left have picked it up. It's wrong in principle. It's tactically ridiculous. It's a gift to the right wing. If somebody comes to campus who you don't like, say Charles Murray, and you break up his meeting, that's a gift to him and to the right wing. Right. They love it. They can then portray themselves as the good guys who are standing up for freedom of speech against these radical thugs who want to destroy everything. So if you want to commit suicide, it's a perfect tactic. What you should do if somebody comes to campus who you don't like is organize a meeting in which you bring people together, expose who it is, what the background is, what we should do about it. That drives them off campus in embarrassment because it's kind of like reputational risk. Right. That's the way you do it, and it's an educational achievement. Now, it's a lot easier to go into a meeting and scream than to take a constructive educational approach like a radical activist would. But just because it's easy doesn't mean it's right. It's kind of like saying, I'm against the establishment, so I'll break a window on Main Street. That's which happens, Yeah. To the weather underground, we're seeing some of it now. Gift to the right wing. That's basically what the letter was about. Actually, it was kind of amazing that there was any reaction at all to the letter, because if you read it, it's so mild.
Yeah.
There's almost nothing. Should have just been a slight tap on the wrist. Nobody should have noticed it. The reaction shows that there really is a problem.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it. It really pushed people from all sides, whatever, the far right, the centrists, even the left. And it was, I think that's exactly it. It shows that there's a real problem. Dr. Chomsky, I wish we could sit down and talk for hours. Hopefully we'll be able to do so in Tucson in the future. I'm an alma mater of University of Arizona, so I wish I was able to be taught by you. But Professor Chomsky, it's been an honor having you on. Thank you for your commitment, for teaching us, and we hope to have you on again soon. Thank you.
Good to talk to you.
If you're not already, please make sure to support us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. That is how we fund the show. Make sure to like and subscribe. We got to get those likes and subscribes up. There's been a real attack on left media, as I'm sure you're seeing. Everybody's being hit hard right now. Everybody who's not supported by bots is being hit hard right now. Everybody who's not being supported by disinformation campaigns is being hit hard right now and isn't corporately funded. So please, if you can, and if you haven't already, and you're capable of becoming a patron or upping your patron, oh my God, that would help pay for another patron who maybe we lost along the way because of the economy. If you are a patron or have been and want to join again, let us know. We will work something out with you. Those are just the numbers that are on the screen, but we're happy to work out different patron levels, cover, on, off for a few months, whatever it is, we will help you, because to me, this is a project that we've worked really hard on, and we've put a lot of thought and effort on what it means to do this show and to be in solidarity with other hosts and what kind of guests we have on. But we're only able to do that because we have patrons. And so please, if you can, come and support us and share our show on all the social media. We want to start doing clips again on social. I think that helps, but it's really about getting the information out there. But thank you to everybody who already is a patron. We love you. We so love you. And we're looking forward to doing some special stuff with you very soon. So many of you have written in about wanting to learn more about how power works, how to organize, and how to move forward really after Bernie Sanders has stepped out of the primary. Where do we go from here now that we don't have a movement leader to guide us? Well, it turns out it is on us, and many of us have to start learning very quickly, especially those who just joined the movement or are younger. You know, our futures depend on you. So one of the tasks that we do with this show is we want to reach out to experts and learn very quickly how to utilize the power that we do have. And I don't think there could be a better expert than the person who probably understands power the most and has had quite a bit of success and has written about it, Jane McAlevey. She is a lifelong activist and organizer, especially around the trade unions. You know her from her books, Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power, and her most recent book, A Collective Bargain, Unions Organizing and the Fight for Democracy, which is so much bigger right now than we probably would have anticipated a couple of weeks ago. Jane, thank you so much for joining us. I know we had a few technical glitches, so hopefully we can say all the wonderful and go even further this time around.
I'm so happy to be talking to you. It's great.
You know, I think I'm just going to start with the obvious question. What power do we have right now in the movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news is we have the same power right now that we had, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ago. That's the truth. And the power we have is our capacity to unite together and stand up and fight like crazy. That hasn't changed. I mean, having a candidate to coalesce around, I think sometimes is convenient. It's helpful. It gives focus to our work. But the truth is, what was interesting, and I think one of the best things about Bernie Sanders is that he himself was clear, and he consistently messaged that even if he had won, it would have taken a gargantuan movement in the streets to actually move policy. That fact hasn't changed. So whether it's Biden or whoever, it's going to take the same amount of heat in the streets as it was going to take if it was Bernie. It's just, do we face, you know, tanks and bulldozers, or do we not? And who knows what Trump would do if Trump is reelected, which is a frightening thought, but by the way, one that I keep at the front of my head every day, because I think we have to be realistic. The Democrats are inept. They've spent the last 45 years undermining their own electoral base. That's the destruction of the trade unions. The most capable part of the base that elected Democrats at the local level, state level, and federally, you know, for 80, 90 years in this country, they've just been systematically destroying. So whether or not the Democrats can pull off November, I think it's a huge question right now. I mean, I really think that Sanders was the candidate to beat Trump. It's obvious that the party itself was going to do damage to him, which they just did. But he was certainly a better candidate to go up against Trump. The COVID disaster, which is ongoing, may give us an opening to actually take down Trump with even a shitty candidate, which is what we're left with at the moment. So, because I think with 17 million people filing unemployment claims, that's 17 million people filing unemployment claims. And I saw an estimate this morning that 20%, we're at 20% unemployment in the United States right now, 20%. We're going to be close to Great Depression numbers. And quite honestly, what happened in the Great Depression is that FDR was elected. And FDR was not, I mean, it wasn't like people elected FDR thinking that he was the Bernie Sanders of the time or realizing that he was going to become the FDR that he became. And that's what I take comfort from. Let's imagine we elect Biden. Just imagine that the crisis is so deep that people finally get really angry. And what I'm hoping, by the way, the scenario I'm hoping for is that the pandemic calms down, you know, soon, next couple of months. We're allowed back out, because I think what's going to happen when we're allowed back out is that there's going to be a wave of strikes in this country that's going to make 2018 and 2019 look tame. And I think it's going to be in the healthcare sector. And I think that nurses, registered nurses who are being asked to kill themselves right now, and hospital workers, every tech, everyone moving a ventilator around, everyone touching them, every healthcare worker who is behaving like every firefighter, but he's not going to get that kind of recognition, by the way. They're just not. Let's just have a genuine discussion at some point. But every nurse and hospital worker running into work right now with no protective equipment on because they believe in saving people, which is the same exact dynamic of a firefighter running into a burning house. Like, that's what every nurse and hospital worker has been asked to do for the last month in this country with no protective equipment. And what I'm hearing from the thousands of people that I've spent my life helping organize in the healthcare sector is we should prepare for like tires burning in the street. And it'd be nice, by the way, if we could get a more ecologically perfect thing to burn. But I really think that there's going to be a fight back that's going to be fierce. And I think that the 2 years of strikes that we saw in 2018 and 2019, like, set the stage, reminded a whole new generation of workers who haven't seen strikes, that when this is over and we can all come out again and they start moving the austerity, cutback, rollback, we're going to make all you people pay again, we're going to make the working class pay for the failures of the 1% again, I think it's going to be a kind of a hell no. I think if we do our work right, and this is where the energy of a lot of the Sanders campaigners, I hope, go, and the supporters go, is into unleashing a flurry of strikes in this country. Learning how to do strike support, learning how to jump in there and actually get the whole community behind what I anticipate is going to be some strikes coming out of the healthcare sector, strikes in the education sector. We know we're seeing strikes in sort of the just-in-time logistics sector. Those three sectors are like the most important sectors there are right now in this country. And 2 out of 3 of them, which is healthcare and education, I think 2 out of 3 of them have the capacity and are primed to go. I think in the logistics sector, there's an amazing potential for power, coming back to the power discussion, and we're in the power discussion, but really being clear about power. The logistics sector, the Amazon, all the just-in-time stuff, the delivery people, that's got great potential for power, but we haven't seen it realized yet because the infrastructure has not been there yet for people.
Right, you have the national nurses, you have the teachers unions, which especially the membership base is very educated in how to organize, and they're more radical than, say, like SEIU, which the members are, but the leadership is not quite there.
Yeah, leadership of most of the national unions, by the way, as evidenced by, did you see, I'm sorry, it's the first time I'm talking about it in public, we should talk about it for a minute. Did you read that opinion piece that 4 labor leaders published in USA Today several years ago? Yes, you're rolling your eyes. So is everyone I know. I mean, if that's an indication of what the national leadership's position is right now, to like celebrate a handful of capitalists for,
throwing out candy. I don't know.
Sitting down and talking about following safety protocols, it was an outrageous opinion piece. And so I think honestly from the bottom up, which is where the strike activity has been coming for the last couple of years, if we see an increase in that, if we see local players and local and regional and state level workers taking action in the education and healthcare sectors, where I think it's really possible, I think it's going to get really interesting. And I think that actually has the potential to shift the balance of power heading into the election, but more important, coming out of the election. Like, part of what I think needs to happen in terms of the power structure analysis, in fact, I think, honestly, the thing that has to happen, given the current power analysis and the austerity that's coming, is way more strikes as fast as possible. In 1932, so when FDR wins in 1932, and I outlined this in a collective bargain in a really succinct chapter, the election happens in 32. Progressives weren't rallying around FDR. Like, he could have been Biden, I guess, on a bad day.
He was an oligarch. I mean, it's not like, we have to remember, he turned on the people who basically got him elected.
Exactly. And then what happened was the smart leftists in the trade union movement, who were mostly not in unions, who mostly didn't have the right to unionize, it's pre the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, and it's what leads to it, is they decide in key geographic areas of the United States and in key sectors, so those are 2 words, key geographies, key sectors, this is power structure analysis. They made the decision to start holding massive strikes. They essentially brought I told a series of mini general strikes happened in 1932, 1933, and 1934, which most people don't know a thing about, because most people think National Labor Relations Act passes, and if they think at all about this, right? They think 1935 National Labor Relations Act passes under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, key part of the New Deal, leaves out a bunch of people, Black people, okay, you know, some gender issues there, but a lot of people get the right to strike for the first time, a lot more than didn't have it, get the right to strike. In theory, it's a theoretical right to strike under the National Relations Act. And so 36 happens, and you see 36 and 37 in Detroit, Flint, the streets, the auto sector, the sit-down strikes. Most people think that's how it began, but actually began in 32, 33, and 34 with the illegal strikes that happened in the cities where leftists in the labor movement calculated, one, workers were ready to go across sectors like in Minneapolis, like in Seattle, like in Oakland, right, in key geographic areas. And that two, that the sort of troops, the dogs, the hoses, and the guns would not be called out on them in certain key areas. That's the same power analysis we need to do right now. Where are the places in this country this time next year, let alone this summer and this fall, right, challenging the election itself, but like even after the election, because we know this crisis is not ending tomorrow, where are the places where we think at the base level, there's enough workers ready to go in enough sectors to start causing what union organizers like to call a serious crisis? Like, how do we create a crisis for capital?
Well, it is, I mean, a state like New York, just to, you know, we've seen a lot of this happen in red states, which is powerful. But, you know, some of them are right to work states, and you know, you have Wisconsin, which of course has a long history of this power struggle, even though there's such Republican rule there, and it's like the test case, you know, they test everything out there. But in a state like New York, which is a union state, it's democratically run, you know, Democratic governors, legislature and Senate and city, that seems like a prime place, especially with COVID, especially because the communities that are affected are frontline. I mean, part of the reason why you've got that belt from Queens to Brooklyn is because so many of the people who are out there delivering are being, you know, put in contact with it, or they don't have access to the right medical care, or there's underlying health issues. So, I mean, these are the workers. These are literally the workers. So in a state like New York, wouldn't you think that that kind of power would push up against people like Cuomo, where they would have to respond because that is their base? It's not like the Republicans that don't have strong labor rules.
I think so. And mostly I think it'll be hard. I mean, look, Cuomo is no real friend of working people. Sorry. Right. Sorry to break the news to everyone.
No, we've covered that one on the show.
Not a surprise on your show. I know. It's a surprise for a lot of people, though. Whenever I say that, Cuomo, are you kidding me? Like, the guy is gutting Medicaid as the COVID crisis is happening, whatever. So, but what he's not going to have the capacity to do, I don't believe, is call out the National Guard against nurses in scrubs and healthcare workers and educators on the streets of New York, or frankly in upstate. There's plenty of heat in Buffalo, by the way. There's some amazing nurse organizing going on up there and other work. So I think that's what I mean by power and power structure analysis. If we start, and if the generation coming out of the Bernie campaign starts to really analyze where are the places that workers can be ready to go, how can people who are not yet in the union start building alliances right now, start building operations to bring the broader community into the fight, right? Because that's key. Every big strike, if we don't have the entire public with us, we're not going to win, right? Like, we actually need the public on the streets with us. Really strong unions like the Los Angeles teachers were able to bring the community with them because they had strategically been working with the community for several years leading up to that strike. And they still are. And there's a lot of unions who are smart at the local level and really realizing, including even SIU locals. I mean, this is the dynamic about the American labor movement that's really important for people to understand. There's the national position holders. They hold positions. Then there's the leadership and the rank and file out in the field. And in a lot of places, the rank and file leadership has kind of had it. You know what I mean? And they're looking around the country and going, Marriott, the United Here workers won the Marriott strike. The educators are winning the educator strikes, red state and blue states. Even the AT&T workers pulled off a victory in 9 southern states. There's a lot of, the United Food and Commercial Workers and the Stop and Shop strike in New England. I have to say that's an example where a union was not really ready. That union was not really ready for the Stop and Shop strike in any way compared to like the LA teachers were ready for their strike, or the Oakland teachers, or the fall Chicago teachers in their magnificent rerun of the strike again this past fall. There's some unions that are really ready for it. They're building for it. They're getting ready. There are some unions, and I think in some ways analyzing power and the fights to come, where it's just, if we're honest, which I think everyone can be and must be in these moments, They weren't. The United Food and Commercial Workers were not ready for the Stop and Shop strike. And here's what happened, which was magnificent. And it's a sign of things to come, I hope, as someone who has lived through 2.5 decades of internecine warfare among unions. What happened in the New England Stop and Shop strike was that a lot of unions around New England who are well organized saw that strike coming and literally threw down and said, we're going to put all the internecine warfare aside. And there's a really strong state federation of labor in Massachusetts. Again, kind of rare. There's actually a strong one in Maine. There's a handful of places where the state federations of labor function like they're supposed to. And it started in Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Federation of Labor, which is actually a pretty decent statewide federation, said, everyone cut the bullshit, everyone stop fighting. Everyone in the unions in this state that knows how to actually strike is going to go help those workers win. And there was a huge act of solidarity that broke out where the organizers from the nurses unions, the organizers from the building trades are progressive and good up in Boston, like a whole bunch of highly skilled organizers kind of quietly just like threw down and went to help the workers in the Stop and Shop struggle, which is part of why people pulled it off. That's one. So solidarity, you know, as we know, hello, solidarity works. Two, it was people trading skill sets. Two, the public completely rose up around those workers in the Stop and Shop struggle, which should be an indicator to the food supply chain of what's coming for them too. The public, before COVID, before we were asking grocery store workers to give up their life to collect cash to feed people, right? Like, people were already siding with the Stop and Shop workers. People have been siding in red states and blue states with workers on strike. I think the public is ready to support people, but that needs to be organized, right? You can't just be like, oh, there's public support. And this is where a lot of the Bernie energy, I hope, is going to go, is into both going into workplaces that are strategic. So what should young people who are working for Bernie, who might need to go into the workforce still do? Go into the logistics sector, go into the healthcare sector, go into the education sector. They will continue to be strategic sectors moving forward, where people can come in, get good training, and figure out how to lead a new wave of massive strikes in this country, because we're going to need it. That's the power analysis. If you look at the Supreme Court, shift to the next, we're done. Like, the Supreme Court is going to undo like 50 years of settled law. They've already done some of it. They're going to do more of it. So the courts are done. Just forget. I feel like the courts are just done.
I mean, forget the fight over the courts, just to be clear.
No. Just give up on the idea that lawsuits and advocacy work anymore. You know what I mean? Like, forget it. No, we should fight about the courts, but like, we don't have anywhere near the power we need to fight. You know, we just got to keep building the base right now. And so all those lawsuits, all the advocacy strategies, I mean, McConnell owns the federal bench at this point, practically, right, with the number of judges he's been appointing. So the judicial system is going to be a disaster for us for a long time. Your lifetime, my lifetime, sorry to say it, for a lot of lifetimes, it's going to be a bad court. And the electoral process, like, it's like a chicken and egg thing of like, I always say to people, well, how are you going to do it? And they say, well, we just need to overturn Citizens United and get campaign financing correct. And I'm like, okay, and what's your plan for that?
Yeah.
There's really only one plan right now, and the plan involves workers taking massive strike actions. And that is still within our reach, and we can still do it.
I want to talk to you a little bit about how we got here, too, because I think so much of this comes down to really your coming of age, where your activism has been. You've been right there on the front lines as a witness and opponent to many of the folks who sort of designed, I guess, where we are today. I mean, it's not just that we have neoliberals. We have the Koch brothers who started organizing in the late 70s and early 80s with their money to take over the legislatures, to eventually win over the courts. They knew that the demographics were working against them, as did probably, the neoliberals see now that the demographics, may not necessarily work with them. So they have to out-strategize so that they stay in power, and then they can control the masses, because the demographics are really the masses, right? So looking at like the late 70s and early 80s, this is also the time when unions, there was a crackdown with unions. The Democrats eventually pulled away from putting money into state parties, and that's kind of where that pipeline of talent would come from, where you found the organizers who knew how to fight every single time. And the one thing we're hearing from young people right now that were involved with Bernie is, I want to be involved, I just don't know how. And a lot of that is because this pipeline has been completely, I mean, it barely exists, let's be honest, with exception to states where there's a real union presence. So how do people develop these skills that you have been teaching? Where do they go first to learn about how to move power?
Yeah, it's a really good question because the infrastructure really has been decimated in some ways. I mean, let's just say one word about what existed sort of before 1970 on the sort of progressive side, and then come back to like, where can people go? So in my second book, In No Shortcuts, I sort of give this, my whole, it's like my PhD dissertation. I give the whole analysis of like everything I'd learned as an organizer. I just went and then like regurgitated, read a bunch of stuff, and then put it back out into No Shortcuts. And went looking in the academy, like took some time to try and figure out, was my theory that the right wing took all their lessons from the civil rights movement and the trade union movement of the 30s through the late 60s, the right wing sort of said, it's the base, stupid. Like, we actually need to go organize a base of people so that we look legitimate and that there's actually a base out there. They chose two sectors. They sort of built the National Rifle Association to be like a grassroots operation. And if people don't think that's grassroots, they're crazy. That is not grass tops. The NRA is a base organization, right? They've got real people in large numbers who are willing to act. And they built the evangelical church. So at that exact same time, sadly, the progressives kind of do a stupid moment, like, which is we're paying the price for it now. And that's why there's no infrastructure and why there's no pipeline. The sort of progressives think, oh, look, okay, we won the Civil Rights Act, we won the Voting Rights Act, we won the Clean Water Act, we won the Clean Air Act. We forced Nixon to sign these things. We've got the Title IX amendments. Women got a few gains in there. Okay, I got to play sports. Happy. I got to play sports. Okay, whatever. Anyway, the things we consider huge victories. But so, and our side said, well, we won all these things. All we have to do now is like hire a bunch of staff, a bunch of lobbyists, move into Washington and implement our federal laws. And we systematically, on our side, began to dismantle the emphasis of base building out in the field. So for about 40 years, we were contributing to our own decline by deprioritizing that which the right wing was prioritizing, which was base building.
Was that because of greed, or was it intent? Was it like stupidity? Was it an accident? Was it a lack of foresight? I mean, how could this party that was a union party, let's not forget that they also kicked out union members from the party. Was it because they wanted to concentrate money towards, I don't know, the ad buyers or something? I mean, that's what it is now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's multiple fold. I think the first big blow was McCarthyism, and I feel like we don't pay enough attention to how much damage that did. So every smart leftist, and certainly I always think to myself, if I was doing the same work then that I've been doing for the last 20 years now, I would have been thrown out of the union and or put in jail and all the things that happened during that period. So I think we start by understanding that the primary intent of McCarthyism was partly about keeping the Jim Crow South, right? And the weapon for them was to destroy the trade unions, because the trade unions were forcibly helping to integrate the South. This is like part of the story I tell in A Collective Bargain. I go back to the origins of why they were doing what they were doing when McCarthyism begins, 46, 47, 48, 49, and then 50s hit. And they decide, the Jim Crow folks team up again with the corporate right in the North and say, we got to stop these unions because they're taking away your profits and they're integrating the South. And that's a big problem. So they set out to destroy the unions. They create McCarthyism. They make up whether or not you're in the party. It doesn't really matter, right? We know what they did. What most people don't realize is that they gutted 10,000 of the smartest leftists from the trade union movement. So that sets up this like period of dull, boring business unionism, where the unions, in the 60s start to play nice, and they think it's like a social compact they have with corporations, and they're just going to keep getting these nice contracts. That was a huge, huge misread of history, as some of the national trade union leaders in the 1960s were thinking, hey, we're going to keep getting these contracts. We can work with these guys now. We've got the framework for being legitimate players in the economy and in politics. Meanwhile, the right was off making plans to launch a second offensive, which was unleashing an army of union busting consultants in the early 1970s that then set up the Reagan election to say we're going to finally gut the unions, right? And the final wave of that is now with the public sector, Wisconsin, which you were on. But so I think a lot of it was self-inflicted ones. Like we actually just did some serious damage to our side, but that damage was set up by McCarthyism taking the left out of the labor movement. So the labor movement becomes a more conservative, more business-oriented force. We have a little glimmer of hope in the 70s from the civil rights movement coming into the public sector of the trade union movement. Then Reagan hits, and that's the next excuse for conservative trade union leaders to think, oh, well, we can't go on strike anymore. I mean, they're going to replace all the workers. So it's like, it's both real, but it's also an excuse to like once again dull down the militancy of the trade union movement. And it's, you know, it's not until 2012 in Chicago, really we have to give them the credit, Chicago teachers 2012, light the fire that takes off in 2018 and I think is lit and running. So now the question is, where do young people, or where do people, but particularly a new generation of young folks, 35 and under were my favorite numbers, really like age 35 and under across every racial demographic in the polling. Where do like the 35 and under folks go to get training? It's a super important question. They have to look for the unions where strikes have happened. They have to look for the unions where there's serious organization being built, where there's a small d democratic structure inside the union, and it's generally not going to the national unions. And in fact, the national unions aren't even running organizer training programs the way they were even 20 years ago,
Wow.
25. Yeah, seriously, at all. Like in the early 1990s, you could apply for a series of different weekend-long like apprenticeship testing programs, a 3-day program to get training where unions would see, okay, this person's kind of good, let's bring him in. A lot of those entry pipelines are gone. So now you have to look around and say, you know, can I go to the being rebuilt Midwest Academy of Organizing in Chicago? I would look there, by the way, I'm saying that, I would like look there. Can I go to, let's look at all the education unions where there's been strikes. Let's look at Unite Here, a union that consistently strikes, from Marriott strike. Parts of the Communication Workers of America within it, right? It's a complicated union like SEIU is. Some of it totally dynamic. Some of it, you know, needs some work. So I think that people trying to get in need to look at the unions where there's a small d democratic structure. And then honestly, a lot of them need to take jobs in healthcare, logistics, and education. Like actually take jobs in those 3 key strategic sectors where they will continue to be leading sectors of the dominant US economy right now. They can't be outsourced that easily. So really where those young folks need to go is in jobs in strategic sectors. And then I would argue, get the training internally, whether it's go to a DSA training, lining them up, going to Midwest Academy, looking at labor notes. Like there's a bunch of places where you can look, get real training. You know, I mean, I'm not a shill for I don't care if they photocopy my books. I always say that. Go to the damn library and take it out. There's not about selling them, but you'll get the basic idea of what you're looking for. And it's important to go to the right union, because if you go to the wrong union, not only will you not get trained, you may get really unmotivated.
So,
You know?
so that's interesting because you know, it sort of leads me to this question that is a question that we don't really talk about enough on the left, but I think historically we could see that there's a lot of evidence of this, whether it's the right bringing in union busting consultants who were operating, nobody knew that their colleagues were union busters, or moving all the way through. You know, there's lots of forms of sabotage that those in power will put into organizing. They will try to divide organizers up so that they're not forming solidarity by using, cultural issues or race to divide.
Racism, all of it.
And we see that on the left right now. I mean, I think a lot of young people, we talked about this before, that I don't want to say they're falling for it, but there's a lot of provoked language out there. And sometimes even our younger leaders are falling for tactics that, they might excite a base, they might raise money, to be fair, but it's ultimately not very helpful for the end goal, and it pits us against each other. So I want to ask you, since you are this expert on politics, a little bit about controlled opposition. I know that's a weird term that people throw out there, and it's a little conspiratorial sometimes, but there are organizations. Neoliberalism is essentially controlled opposition, right? I mean, how do we think about those things when there are organizations that might be our allies sometimes and work with our candidates, but maybe other times they support candidates, our opposition or attack us. There's a lot of that. I mean, we have to be real. There's a lot of that. And how do we maneuver when we're trying to build solidarity? And sometimes there are friends and sometimes they're not.
Yeah, I'm just not. To me, the most important thing that we can do, the most important thing that people who are new to the work can do is take a job in a strategic sector in an area where there's a good union, or really an intent on going with a bunch of their friends, like pulling a bunch of people and applying for jobs, going in someplace, doing some study groups, getting in touch with those of us who know how to teach them, right, and train them, and either forming new unions or helping be part of reform slates of existing unions at the local level.
Right.
And here's why I say this, to get to your point. For all the frustrations that we all may have, and certainly me, I mean, all of my books, labor leadership considers them to be very critical of them. I consider them to be tough, friendly criticism, right? I mean, this is like the movement I'm in, and I'm deeply committed to it. But what I think about learning controlled opposition, all this stuff, what I think is learn how to do it. So what's beautiful about union campaigns, what's different about trade union campaigns than any other sector of the progressive movement or the left, is that when you try to form a union, you have to get past the bullshit of the divide and conquer people, because they're in there every day. So one of the stories I tell in the new book about helping to organize thousands of hospital workers in 2016 in Philadelphia, in greater Philadelphia, as part of a large campaign that a whole bunch of us were involved in, that, where workers won. Actually, the biggest organizing campaign in the United States in 2016 was in Philadelphia, and it was a hell of a campaign. And what people learn in these kind of campaigns is that we had professional union busters, we had IRI Inc. This is not just neoliberalism. This is although it's part of it, right? But IRI Inc. is now becoming more of a well-known name because it's who Google has hired. So Google hired IRI Inc. That was a New York Times story, and the story was in early December. And IRI Inc., as soon as I saw the New York Times story, it was like all sorts of people were sending it to me, because IRI Inc. is who we were going up against in Philadelphia in the hospital campaign in 2016. So obviously we know how to overcome these guys. And I have to say my two favorite words, which is method and discipline. Like, we were going up against IRI Inc. in 2016 in a brutal series of rounds of just warfare in the hospitals, where they had, in one hospital in Einstein, they had 18 full-time union busters who came in to do the massive divide and conquer. Yeah. And this is why when people, like when uber super lefty people say, like, we don't need organizers, the rank and file is just going to rise up. I'm like, yeah, to a firing squad. Give me a break. When you have 18 professional union busters hiding behind management, going in and driving wedges, like looking for every wedge they can drive, race, gender, class, immigration, race, gender, class, immigration, and driving those wedges to be successful, which we were, to be successful, you have to learn the methods and the strategies that when you wake up every morning, you have the capacity to actually build solidarity. Like, you have to actively construct solidarity, because there's people actively working to deconstruct solidarity. So our side has to get really good at actively constructing little action by little action that unifies people, even up against really stiff divide and conquer opposition. And the best of union organizers know how to do this. Like, we actually know how to do this. And certainly not just me, there are a lot of really good organizers in this country. You just don't know their names, but I got a ton of colleagues who I've worked with on every campaign, and we know what the hell we're doing, and there's method and discipline, and that's what the Bernie generation needs to learn. Like, get that skill, get that training, because whether it comes to the political, like, I feel like we can take that skill set and we export it. So when I get lent out to political campaigns, which we do, right? If you're a full-time person in the trade union movement, your union will pick you if you win a lot of really hard-fought union elections, and you will get lent out, right, to a campaign. And we often get lent out to the hardest campaigns because we actually understand how to overcome divide and conquer tactics. And that's the kind of tactics that people need to learn for us to defeat massive austerity that's coming down the pike.
I know you have to go soon, but I want to ask you a little bit about the difference between solidarity and, I believe you used the terms mass organizing. Was that the right term?
Mass organizing, yeah. Well, I mean, for me, I'll tell you what, I like to talk about how do you build unbreakable solidarity? Like those words to me really matter. So how do you build solidarity and how do you build unbreakable solidarity, which is what you need for a strike? Because the union busters are coming, right? So when we have an approach of doing large scale organizing, there's an entire theory we have. One part of it's called going to the biggest worst, which is the opposite of what the feminist movement did in the 1970s, trying to pass the ERA. And let me explain what that is. What a lot of activists do, and this is a mistake, please don't do this, activists, left, young people. What a lot of activists do is get comfortable mostly talking to people who agree with them.
Right.
That's what the feminist movement did. I mean, there were a lot of things wrong. Racism inside the white women-dominated movement, tone deaf on race, tone deaf on class. But like what activists did was went to like the easy states to try and pass the Equal Rights Amendment, got really encouraged, like, oh, look, we got 1 state, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20, not realizing that those were the easy states. And if you're a union organizer, you start with the hardest states. Because what you know in a union campaign is if we can win the hardest departments to win, we're going to win this campaign because we're going to save the easier to do work for later in the campaign. Because if you can win the hard part of the campaign, the hard part of the turf, you can actually pull off the whole election because the easier part of the turf is going to come along with you in the end. So there's so much that people trying to figure out electoral work can learn from trade union organizers. That's part of why I keep writing the books. But method and discipline matters. Having a theory of power matters. Having a disciplined method by which you do strategy and that you don't do the strategy until you've done power structure analysis in every campaign and every fight. Like these are all learnable skills and people are desperate for them on the progressive side of the aisle, or we're just going to keep like engaging in wishful thinking and thinking we're going to have some magic solution, and there ain't no magic solution. There's like a bunch of really hard work that we have to do. We can do it. I actually really think we can win. And if the energy that was going into Bernie's campaign goes into people going into strategic workplaces, in strategic sectors, in strategic geographies, in very short time, like I'm thinking 2022, we can cause holy hell, if not 2021, but definitely 2022. And we need it. And that's not far off.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, people feel defeated this time around that may have joined the election this time or feel defeated after 2 elections. But I mean, my one point of wisdom that I can personally say is the neoliberal establishment has never been challenged this way. I mean, they flexed whatever muscles they had, and like Joe Biden was it to defeat Bernie Sanders. But you know, when you really break it down step by step, have a strategy, understand who you're up against, which is what I really appreciate about your work, whether it's electorally or otherwise, you know, and you start kind of like picking those battles, strategic battles, it's much more doable. And if you win the hard ones, like you said, it'll have a domino effect, I believe, a domino effect. So I appreciate your work. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you can come back on because I have so many more questions for you. And I'm sure
when we all come out again, you know, let's have a long discussion. It'll be really great.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Appreciate you. Glad you're doing what you're doing now. It's so nice to have a woman doing an interview. And a smart one. Of course you're smart, you know what I mean? But it's nice to have like a really smart woman. So keep up the good work and I'm happy to come back sometime.
First day
Those were the days, huh, Naomi, when we were in studios?
Those were the days. I have like a light in my apartment.
It's never going to happen again.
I don't even want to tell you what the opposite side of this looks like. It's like I'm pressed up against my couch. I have like pillows over my microphone. It's pretty funny. So, anyways, Thomas Frank, are we? This is going right. Something's going on here.
Evidently, it is. Yeah.
Well, at least you have a nice bookshelf, Thomas.
Well, thank you. It took me
the
years, you know. I was going to actually welcome you to my show. Hey, Naomi, great to see you again. Welcome to the Thomas Frank Show.
Normally, I would be happy to be on your show. So, Thomas, crazy times that we're in right now. We are doing live convention coverage, not from Radio Row, not from like a media studio, but from my apartment in Queens and your place in an undisclosed location.
I never thought I'd be nostalgic for the political conventions, but yeah. This is the first year I haven't gone to them in a very long time. I went to I've been going since '96. You know, wow. and it's not like they're really gratifying politically. They aren't, but it is, it's part of my life. I see all my old friends there, that sort of thing. Anyhow, those days are over.
I just pulled out what was all from 2016. I'm sure you're.
Oh my
with
God!
these.
Yes, I put mine away in a box in the attic. I'm not gonna.
The presidential pass, and that like the FBI. They like clear this. It's crazy.
I know.
It's literally the FBI.
And then you get special passes to go to parties and stuff like that.
And we're so cool that when you go through this process, because just to pull back the curtain a little bit, there's like the cool kids, like the lefty indie types that don't want to be like the sellouts who go to the CNN brunch, but we still go. But we just mock them the whole time.
Yeah, well, so I have many stories that I could tell you about these conventions. Being in close proximity to important politicians, both of the Democratic and the Republican persuasion. The Republicans, by and large, throw better parties. Well, that's just because they have more money and
they have
just
like lobster at their parties.
Yeah, that's right, and they just don't care. They
Right.
just don't care. But anyhow, it's all in the past now.
All in the past. So, Thomas, you are the knower of all things in terms of how the party ended up turning out this way. One of the things that we're trying to do on this show, and I think it's the bright side of this not being at the convention and getting distracted by the glitz and the noise and there's always drama that happens. We can kind of drill into where does the movement go from here? How did we get to this point? And you are the author of Listen Liberal, What's the Matter with Kansas? You've been able to essentially, in a very distillable way, summarize how the party went from being the Workers' Party, or what tried to be the Workers' Party at one point, to becoming
the party of the people. They used to call themselves.
Exactly.
They still do call themselves that. I'm sure if we were there in what is it? It's supposed to be Milwaukee,
right? Supposed to be. Yes, it's Milwaukee.
Yeah. If we were there, you'd be seeing all sorts of stuff about that's who they are.
Eating cheese.
Eating cheese,
all
drinking
day.
beer, and pictures of Franklin Roosevelt, and the band would be playing "Happy Days Are Here Again," and they every couple of years they go in this spectacle and they imagine that that's still who they are, but of course it's not the case.
Right. So. All right.
But Nomi, I have to correct you. You left one out. There's this new book that I've written. I've got a copy.
I only have it in digital form. It's not as sexy.
The people know. So the digital form is good, but you're missing the illustrations. It's the first book of mine ever to have color illustrations in it, and they're really good. It's a lot of political cartoons from the 1890s and stuff like that. Yeah, it's beautiful and horrifying.
So 1890s, when does the Democratic Party, or what we would consider the Democratic Party today, because of course there was a shift in history. When did this all start? When did the parties become a thing?
Oh, well, that goes way, way back. What the reason I start with the 1890s is because that was the last time you had a real third party effort in this country. We have third parties now, like Ralph Nader will run for president, or Ross Perot or something like, whatever. But yeah, Jill Stein, but it will be a single person running for president. It's not the in the 1890s, there was this group called the Populists, and they actually had governors and senators and members of Congress, and running a guy for the presidency was an afterthought. That's, they had to do that because they were a political party, but that wasn't important to them. And the reason they're significant for my purposes is because they invented the word populism, invented it just out of thin air one day in the 1890s. And the reason that's fascinating is because the word has been flipped upside down nowadays. And it's used by people like the New York Times and the Washington Post to signify exactly the opposite of what the original populists stood for. They were a left-wing, third-party, farmer and labor sort of, like our friends up there in Wisconsin. They're very familiar with farmer labor parties. They've had a lot of those sort of things over the years. And the populists were the original along those lines, a left-wing party. And so that's the broad outline of the story that I tell. How did the word get flipped? But along the way, we watched the Democratic Party get flipped as well. And the Republicans move in to try to take over that language of populism. You can look at a guy like Donald Trump, and I'm sure next week when the Republicans meet in, where is it? Is it Jacksonville? I don't even know.
It's Jackson. I think it's Jackson. It was moved. It was.
Yeah, it was moved. But the whole thing is just, and I don't think they're going to be in either of the two locations. They're not going to be in Jacksonville, and they're not going to be in Charlotte. I think Trump is going to speak from like the White House,
yeah,
or the Lincoln Memorial or something like that.
Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, well, no, I don't think it won't be Mar-a-Lago. It won't be that. He doesn't like to talk about. I mean, that's too ritzy. His whole act is that he's a man of the people himself. It's just so ridiculous when you think about it. But he is not unique. They've been doing this populist act since Nixon, and Reagan did it, Pat Buchanan did it, and now Trump. And it's not going to go away when Trump goes down to a much deserved defeat in November. Knock on wood. When Trump goes down to that much deserved defeat, there's going to be another Republican fake populist that's going to leap up to take his place. And the Democrats are going to cry some more when he beats whoever, whoever is.
Well, the polls today were tied. I mean, just a week ago, Biden was leading by 14.
No way.
I know. I don't know. I mean, so
how a man can't bungle an epidemic like this and still hope to be reelected. I mean, just on the fundamentals of it, you've got 10% unemployment, this mass die-off of small businesses. You can't, he can't be reelected in a situation like this. He's so utterly incompetent. At the end of the day, people want someone sitting in the Oval Office that right. knows something about how government is supposed to work, rather than a guy that just complains because his wishes aren't transformed into reality.
You're not removing the postal boxes quick enough. Get to it. Come on.
This is insane. And what I like to remind people, this has been going on for a long time. The Republican war on the Postal Service, a long time, and this is just only the latest iteration of it. Who loved the post office was the populists, the people in the 1890s. They invented, one of their inventions was rural free delivery, because it was a farmer movement. Right. And they wanted to have postal savings banks. They wanted you to be able to go into the all of these sort of things. They loved the idea of the post office. They wanted the government to run all sorts of industries in the way it ran the post office. And anyhow.
So Thomas, let's talk. I mean, for so many of our listeners who have been introduced to politics through Bernie Sanders, either last time around or this time around, I mean, this idea of neoliberalism, if you're 18 years old, it's all you've ever known. Hell, I'm 36 years old. It's all I've ever known. But it really, it's like it brainwashed my part of the generation, and we had to break out of that. But if you're 18 years old today, you actually understand the differences between progressivism and populism and neoliberalism. So, I mean, going back to your book, Listen Liberal, which I think for the party right now, just talking about the divisions in the party, how did this all start?
Well, it goes way back. So, but for our purposes, the important period is the late 1960s, the Vietnam War. The party was torn in two over the Vietnam War, because obviously President Lyndon Johnson was a very liberal Democrat, and also the Vietnam War was his baby. And a lot of the parties sort of, at the time, the Democratic Party, this is going to be hard for young people to understand, the Democratic Party was very, very closely identified with organized labor, with labor unions in America. This is when I was a little kid. And it was, everyone knew that. That's who the Democratic Party was. And the unions, Johnson was a great friend to them. And and for their part, they backed him up. Their leadership did anyways, on the Vietnam War. And they supported him even in this terrible, stupid undertaking. And, they had the Democratic Convention in 1968, the riots going on, the country is coming apart. And the Democratic Party develops a whole sort of alternative understanding of itself when all this is over, when the dust has settled. And Hubert Humphrey lost for the presidency, by the way, the last candidate who was he was very, very close to the unions, and he lost. And the Democratic Party developed an alternate sort of a plan for itself, where they would no longer be the party of unions and of working people, but they would be the party of these extremely idealistic kids coming off of college campuses, kids like Bill Clinton and that sort of thing. Now, ironically, these kids turned out to not be quite as liberal as they as they seem to be at first, because, of course, they aren't. They're not the working class. They are, these are people with good college educations, and they go into the professions, and their economic interests are really not with this sort of New Deal state. That's not who they care about. They want to succeed. They say the New Deal is over, and the Democratic Party develops this whole sort of theory of, what they call the learning class, and how the Democratic Party has to move to the right, and they have to give up on unions, they have to give up on working people, but most importantly, they have to give up on the New Deal and the legacy of Roosevelt. Now, they still want those people to vote for them, of course, but they don't want to. They don't want to spend any effort on that. That's not who they are anymore. And the rest is history. You've got people like Bill Clinton, who comes up with all these trade agreements, deregulates Wall Street, does these incredible favors for Roosevelt's old enemies. They even put Social Security on the chopping block, and they never went through with it because he got impeached. But they would have done it, they would have done it, and that would have been the Democrats.
But what I don't understand, and Joe Biden was a big part of that, and that was a big attack
he
on
certainly
Joe Biden.
Was. That's right.
As well as the crime bill, that was a big attack on him. Joe Biden is of that era. He is, of the New Democrats that.
Yes, he is. And you just put your finger on something that in Listen Liberal, one of the worst things that this new generation of Democrats did is they became real hawks on law and order and on locking people up. And they came up with all of these, in my mind, really, really cruel ways of law enforcement, of prosecuting the war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, on and on, 3 strikes rules, on and on and on. Do these terrible, terrible things that resulted in mass incarceration, in the U.S. having a bigger percentage of its population in prison than any country that has ever existed, et cetera, et cetera. And in my mind, that's probably the worst thing that these guys did. Although deregulating Wall Street is up there, the trade agreements are up there. Biden had a hand in all of it.
But why? This is what I don't understand. What was it about, especially like as they started to form in the late 70s, early 80s after, Carter into Reagan? What was the justification for shifting away from unions who had a lot of money? This wasn't and a
lot of members. Remember, they still to this day have millions and millions of people.
Exactly. So what was the point of saying, okay, we're abandoning this force and moving towards becoming more conservative and privatizing the shift to Wall Street? I've heard the justification is the Republicans started taking big money after the campaign finance laws started to weaken. They had to compete on TV because TV was expensive. But is that enough to shift the entire ethos of the party?
It shouldn't be, because there's plenty of examples in the past, and so the people know spends a great deal of time on Franklin Roosevelt and the election in 1936, where he's outspent in a sort of astronomical way. The newspapers of America come together against him everywhere you turn. If you were a ordinary citizen in 1936, you turn on the radio and they're denouncing him again. The campaign against him is everywhere you look, and yet he wins in an overwhelming landslide, one of the greatest landslides of all time. And so what that shows, if nothing else, there's all sorts of lessons in 1936 for today. But one of the things that it shows you is that, no, you don't have to be the party with all the money. That's not necessarily the only position out there. But the New Democrats convinced themselves that it was that, well, look, Naomi, if you want to be really, really cynical about it, it's a lot more fun to be the party of money than it is to be the party of organized labor. You said it yourself. You go to the Republican convention and they're serving lobster. I went to a party at the Republican convention in 2004 that was held in the New York Yacht Club. And you know what? It was lavish. I went to a party that they had in Minneapolis in what year was that? It was 2008, and the Sarah Palin convention, where they had rented out a bar in some hotel and all they were serving was Maker's Mark. That was it. And you could get it made into all these different cocktails, but that's all they were serving. And it's insanely lavish. It's really nice being the party of money. It's
so that's all it was. Is they realized that, but back and just to
right. But let's not take that really cynical tack, because that's not the whole answer.
I mean, I think it's especially true in the Obama era, because you can get away. You can still be quote unquote woke, but also make money. But in the late 70s, they weren't even woke. I mean, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, Al Gore.
Well, Nomi, in my opinion, they aren't really woke now. It's just that's just superficial. That's just But
they're able to appeal to like a more capitalist,
but think about
diverse
it this way.
capitalism that is like it's a way to justify their capitalism and still be Democrats and not Republicans. But in the late 70s,
that's right. And
none of that.
Right, but let's talk about the present for a moment, because this is how my new book ends. It ends with this chapter on what Democrats look like today. I call it the utopia of scolding, where they're both a ruling class. They're not the ruling class, because the ruling elite, this is a big country, it's very complex. There's a lot of different elites, but the liberal elite is a huge part of it. All of these people coming out of the fancy universities, the highly educated white collar professional class that is a sort of core Democratic constituency. They're not just an elite. They understand themselves to be a very righteous elite. So elites in the past would, there would always be a sense of guilt that they were to be a billionaire in a democracy, to be a billionaire in a country that produces people like Frank Capra, and Thomas Jefferson and that sort of thing. There's something disgusting about that, and there's something dirty about it. But to be an elite where you know that you are more moral than everybody else, and you're more enlightened than everybody else, and especially than the working class, the rank and file of democracy, those people are deplorables. They're irredeemable. They don't understand. They didn't go to good schools. They don't know the language. They're fundamentally unenlightened. They're in the grip of these pathologies. So you're not just a ruling class, but you're a better class. You're a higher quality people. To be both financially an elite and also morally an elite, it's so attractive. There's something so seductive about being that. And that's really who they are, or how they understand themselves today. And you asked, why aren't they going to change when it's so obvious? Well, maybe you didn't ask that, but we would have come to that anyway, because it's so obvious, right? Like, you're running a political party. Politics is about getting more votes than the other guy. Don't you want to be the group that is, you have to be coming up with some way of doing that. Well, no, they aren't really interested in that. They've got their utopia now. They're already in it. It's incredibly satisfying to be one of these people.
They're not Trump.
Exactly.
And they're very good at
and they can just wag their finger at Trump voters and laugh at them and tell them to put their goddamn mask on, you stupid morons. And I'm sorry. I talk about this a lot, but believe me, folks, I wear a mask. Here it is. I'm going to step outside and put this on just to make sure it still works.
Hashtag mandatory mask and universal health care. Okay. Medicare for all.
Yes.
Thomas Frank, thank you for your insights as always.
We have just begun. We're just getting started here.
Wait. I've got a proposal. Our show's an hour long. Next week we're doing the RNC, so I'm going to put you on the spot.
Oh, yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it.
We'll finish up.
Hell yes.
Thanks, Thomas. Check out Thomas Frank's new book. Got it? Lift it up. Show it to everybody.
The people know.
The people know. You can get it at any independent bookstore that delivers. And if you really want to.
Oh, one other thing, Nomi, if you go on my website on tcfrank.com, I've got all the illustrations from the book there, so you can check it out. You get a good sense of what it's about just from that.
I can't wait. And also, if you haven't read Listen Liberal and What's the Matter with Kansas, basically every few years, Thomas decides to remind us why the Democrats have lost their way.
And the Republicans, they're both lost. It's all lost, Nomi.
The Republicans are extinct. They're just, really good at holding on to power, having 4 people in control.
Yes,
Ben Shapiro is the future of the Republican Party.
Oh my God. Don't even.
Next week. All right. Thank you so much, Thomas.
It's my pleasure.
The Nomiki Show. flash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, faith fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show.